Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The crackle of the campfire was the only sound breaking the stillness of the night. I should have felt at peace, but an inexplicable unease had settled over me like a heavy blanket. Little did I know my gut instinct was trying to warn me of the terror that awaited in the shadows. I've always been an avid solo camper, finding solace in the quiet of nature away from the chaos of city life. This trip to the heart of the Cascade Mountains was supposed to be my escape, a chance to clear my head and reset. The first 2 days had been blissful, hiking through lush forests, dipping my toes in crystal clear streams and breathing in the crisp mountain air as I crawled into my tent. That third night, exhaustion from a long day of trekking quickly pulled me into a deep sleep, but something jolted me awake in the early hours of the morning. At first I couldn't put my finger on what had disturbed me. The forest was silent, almost too silent. I laid still, straining my ears for any sound. There, a twig snapped somewhere outside my tent. My heart began to race. Probably just a deer or some other animal, I tried to reassure myself, but then I heard it again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. With trembling hands I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The beam of light cut through the pre-dawn darkness, illuminating the ground around my campsite. That's when I saw them, footprints in the soft earth, definitely human, circling my tent. I quickly zipped the tent back up, my mind racing. How long had someone been out there? What did they want? I was miles from the nearest trail, let alone any sort of civilization. Nobody should be out here. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I cautiously emerged from my tent, determined to assess the situation. The footprints were everywhere, crisscrossing my campsite. Some were fresh, the edges still sharp in the damp soil. Others looked older, as if someone had been watching me for days. My blood ran cold as I realized the implications. This wasn't a chance encounter. Someone had been stalking me, observing my every move. The feeling of violation was overwhelming. My safe haven had been invaded and I had been blissfully unaware. I quickly began packing up my gear, constantly glancing over my shoulder. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sent a jolt of fear through me. I needed to get out of there fast. Just as I was rolling up my tent, I heard it again, footsteps, not even trying to be quiet now. They were coming from the dense undergrowth to my left. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Hello, I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. I know someone's there. What do you want? Silence, then a low chuckle that sent shivers down my spine. What do I want? A growly voice responded. I want you to run. I didn't need to be told twice. Abandoning the rest of my gear, I grabbed my backpack and sprinted in the opposite direction. I could hear heavy footsteps behind me, branches snapping as my pursuer gave chase. I ran blindly through the forest, ducking under LWH hanging branches and leaping over fallen logs. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but fear kept me going. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what or who I might see after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. I burst out of the tree line onto a rocky outcrop. The ground dropped away steeply on three sides, leaving me nowhere to go. I was trapped, gasping for breath. I finally turned to face my pursuer, but the forest behind me was still no sign of movement among the trees. Had I lost them, or were they still out there watching, waiting? I sank to the ground, my legs no longer able to support me. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of my situation began to sink in. I was alone in the wilderness, miles from help, with a potential predator stalking me. My tent, most of my supplies, and critically my satellite phone were all back at the campsite. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, I weighed my options. I could try to make my way back to my campsite to retrieve my gear, but the thought of returning there made my skin crawl. The alternative was to try to find my way back to civilization with minimal supplies and no map. In the end, survival instinct won out. I had to get back to my gear if I wanted any chance of getting out of these mountains alive. Moving as quietly as I could, I began to retrace my steps. Every sound made me jump. A squirrel scampering up a tree nearly gave me a heart attack. I Felt exposed, vulnerable, sure that at any moment I would feel a hand grab me from behind. When I finally spotted the familiar clearing where I had made camp, I almost cried with relief. But that relief was short-lived. As I approached, I realized something was wrong. My tent was still there, but it had been slashed open. My backpack, which I'd left behind in my haste to flee, had been emptied, its contents strewn across the campsite, and they're pinned to a tree with a hunting knife was a note. With shaking hands, I approached and read the scrolled message. "Better luck next time, I'll be seeing you soon." Terror gripped me and knew this wasn't over. Whoever had been stalking me was playing a sick game, and they weren't done yet. I grabbed what supplies I could salvage get, including my satellite phone, which miraculously had been overlooked in the ransacking of my gear. With trembling fingers, I dialed emergency services. 911, what's your emergency? I need help. I managed to choke out. I'm in the Cascade Mountains. Someone's been stalking me. They've destroyed my camp. I don't know if they're still out here. The dispatcher's calm voice was like a lifeline. She assured me help was on the way and instructed me to find a safe open area where a rescue helicopter could spot me. I spent the next few hours huddled on the rocky outcrop I had fled to earlier, jumping at every sound. When I finally heard the whir of helicopter blades, I broke down in tears of relief. As I was lifted to safety, I scanned the forest below one last time. There, at the edge of the tree line, I caught a glimpse of a figure watching me. Even from this distance, I could feel the weight of their stare. A chill ran through me as I realized this might not be over. The wilderness had always been my sanctuary, a place of peace and solitude, but now as the helicopter carried me away from the mountains, I knew that solitude would never feel the same again. The forest had shown me its darker side, and the shadows between the trees would forever hide the potential threats. In my mind, as we flew towards civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere down there my stalker was already planning our next encounter. The mountains had become a hunting ground, and I had narrowly escaped being prey, but the game, it seemed, was far from over. The desert stretched endlessly before me, a sea of sand and scrub brush painted in hues of orange and red by the setting sun. I'd been driving for hours, the monotony of the landscape broken only by the occasional tumbleweed or distant mesa. That's when I saw him, a lone figure on the side of the road, thumb outstretched. Desperation etched on his face. Little did I know that this simple act of kindness would plunge me into a night of terror. I'm not usually one to pick up hitchhikers' years of cautionary tales and true crime podcasts had taught me better, but something about this guy struck a chord. Maybe it was the haunted look in his eyes, or the way he seemed to be constantly glancing over his shoulder. Whatever it was, I found myself slowing down, gravel crunching under my tires as I pulled onto the shoulder. "Where you headed?" I called out, rolling down my window. "Anywhere but here, man," he replied, his voice raspy and tinger with fear. "Please, I just need to get as far away as possible." Against my better judgment, I unlocked the passenger door, hopped in. He scrambled into the car, tossing a small backpack at his feet. Up close, I could see he was young, probably mid-20s, with wild, unkempt hair and a few days' worth of stubble on his chin. His clothes were dirty and torn, like he'd been running through the desert for days. "Thanks," he muttered, sinking into the seat. "I'm Jake." "Tom," I replied, pulling back onto the empty highway. "You okay? You look like you've been through hell." Jake let out a bitter laugh. "You have no idea." "Man, no idea." We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional static from the radio as it struggled to find a signal. Out here in the middle of nowhere, I could feel the tension radiating off Jake in waves. Every few minutes he'd twist in his seat to look out the rear window, as if expecting to see someone following us. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. "You running from something, Jake?" He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Not something, someone, a whole lot of someone's." Actually, my grip tightened on the steering wheel. "What do you mean?" Jake took a deep breath. "I got mixed up with some bad people, gang. They promised me easy money, you know, but it wasn't easy, and it wasn't just money. They were after." A chill ran down my spine. What had I gotten myself into? They made me do things, Jake continued, his voice cracking. "Terrible things. I couldn't take it anymore, so I ran, but they don't let people just walk away. They're after me now, and if they catch me." He trailed off. But I could fill in the blanks. I swallowed hard, suddenly very aware of how alone we were out here in the desert. How far behind you are they? Jake shook his head. I don't know, but they won't stop until they find me. I'm sorry, man, I shouldn't have gotten you involved in this. If you want to drop me off at the next town. No, I interrupted, surprising myself. No, I'm not going to abandon you out here. We'll figure something out. Relief flooded Jake's face. Thank you. You have no idea what this means to me. As night fell, the desert transformed. The vast emptiness that had seemed almost peaceful in the daylight now felt oppressive, hiding untold dangers. In its shadows we drove on the headlights, cutting a narrow path through the darkness. It was around midnight when I first noticed the lights in my rearview mirror, distant at first, but steadily growing closer. Jake, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, don't look now, but I think we've got company. He twisted in his seat, peering out the back window. He hissed at them. How did they find us so fast? My mind raced. We were still miles from the nearest town. There was nowhere to hide out here, nowhere to run. Hold on, I growled, pressing down on the accelerator. The old sedan groaned in protest, but picked up speed. The lights behind us grew brighter. I could make out the outline of a large truck, now gaining on us. Faster, Jake urged, panic evident in his voice. Please, you have to go faster. I was already pushing the car to its limits. The engine whined, and I could smell something burning. We weren't going to be able to outrun them. Suddenly, I spotted a narrow dirt road branching off from the highway. Without thinking, I yanked the wheel hard to the right. We fishtailed as we hit the unpaved surface, kicking up a cloud of dust behind us. The truck overshot the turn, buying us a few precious seconds. I killed the headlights, plunging us into near total darkness as I navigated the twisting path by moonlight alone. Where does this road go? Jake asked, clinging to his seat as we bounced over the rough terrain. No idea, I admitted, but it's our only shot. We drove for what felt like ours, every bump and jolt sending a spike of fear through me. Had we lost them, or were they still out there searching? Just as I was starting to think we might have escaped, I saw it, a flash of light in the distance. They had found the road. I muttered, Jake, we need to ditch the car. It's too easy to spot out here. He nodded grimly. I pulled off to the side of the road. Cutting the engine, we grabbed what supplies we could, some water bottles, a flashlight, and Jake's backpack, and set off into the desert on foot. The night was eerily quiet, our labored breathing and the crunch of our footsteps on the sandy ground seeming impossibly loud. Every few minutes we'd pause to listen for any sign of pursuit. We had been walking for about an hour when we heard at the distant rumble of engines. This way, Jake hissed, grabbing my arm and pulling me towards a cluster of large boulders. We scrambled behind them, pressing ourselves against the cool stone. The sound grew louder. Headlights swept across the desert, illuminating our hiding spot for a heart-stopping moment before moving on. We held our breath as a con of vehicles passed by on the road we had abandoned. Once the sounds had faded into the distance, we allowed ourselves to breathe again. That was close. I whispered. Jake nodded, his face pale in the moonlight. Too close. We need to keep moving. There's an old mining town about 10 miles from here. If we can make it there, we might be able to find help. And so we walked. The night was cold, and I found myself shivering despite the exertion. Jake kept up a steady stream of chatter, telling me about the gang, how he had gotten involved, and all the things he wished he had done differently. I think he was talking more to keep himself calm than for my benefit, but I listened anyway, offering the occasional word of encouragement as the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. We crested a hill and saw it, a collection of dilapidated buildings in the distance, the abandoned mining town. We made it. Jake breathed, a note of hope in his voice for the first time since I'd picked him up, but our relief was short-lived. As we approached the town, we heard the unmistakable sound of engine. No, Jake moaned. How did they find us? We ducked behind an old water tower, watching in horror as 3 trucks rolled into the center of town. Men with guns jumped out, spreading out to search the building. What do we do now? I asked, fear clawing at my throat. Jake was quiet for a moment, his face a mask of guilt and resolve. You've done more than enough for me already. I can't ask you to risk your life any further. There's a ravine just past the edge of town. If you can make it there, you should be able to follow it to safety. I shook my head. I'm not leaving you here to face them alone. You have to, he insisted. This is My mess, I need to face it, but you can still get out of this, please Tom, go, and thank you. For everything. Before I could protest further, Jake stood up and walked out from behind the water tower, hands raised. I'm here, he shouted. It's me, you want leave the town alone? I watched helpless as the men surrounded Jake. There was a brief scuffle, and then they were loading him into one of the trucks. As the convoy started to pull away, I made a decision. I couldn't just leave Jake to whatever fate awaited him. Staying low, I crept towards the last truck in line. Just as it was about to move, I managed to grab onto the back, hauling myself into the truck bed. As we drove off into the rising sun, I knew the night of terror wasn't over. It was just beginning, but I also knew that whatever happened next, I wasn't going to abandon the desperate hitchhiker who had turned my world upside down. The desert stretched out behind us, silent and indifferent to the drama that had played out under its starry skies, and ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the faint glimmer of hope that somehow, against all odds, we might just make it out of this alive. The key clicked in the lock, and the musty scent of disuse wafted out as I pushed open the heavy wooden door. Welcome to your home away from home, I announced cheerfully. Ushering my family inside, the cabin stood silent, shadows lurking in its corners, holding secrets I couldn't yet fathom. If only I had known then what horrors awaited us in this picturesque woodland retreat. My name is Sarah, and I'd spent months planning this family getaway. Between my demanding job as a software engineer and my husband Mike's busy schedule as a high school teacher, not to mention our kids' endless activities, we desperately needed some quality time together. When I stumbled upon this secluded cabin rental online, it seemed perfect. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just us and nature for a solid week. As we explored the cabin, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The living room was cozy with a stone fireplace and plush sofas. The kitchen, though dated, had all the essentials. Upstairs there were 3 bedrooms, one for Mike and me, one for our 14-year-old son Jack, and one for our 11-year-old daughter Emma. Mom, this place is awesome, Jack exclaimed, flopping onto the living room sofa. Can we go explore the woods? I laughed, relieved to see him excited about something other than his video games. For once, sure honey, but let's get unpacked first, okay? As I was putting away our clothes in the master bedroom, I heard Emma's voice from down the hall. Mom, Dad, can you come here for a second? There was something in her tone that made me pause. Mike and I exchanged glances before hurrying to Emma's room. We found her standing on a chair, peering intently at something in the corner of the ceiling. What's wrong, sweetie? Mike asked. Emma pointed. What's that? I squinted, following her gaze. There, nestled in the corner, where the walls met the ceiling, was a small black object. My stomach dropped as I realized what it was. A camera. It's probably just a smoke detector, I said quickly, not wanting to alarm Emma, but I knew better. And from the look on Mike's face, so did he. Why don't you and Jack go check out the backyard? Mike suggested, his voice carefully controlled. Mom and I will finish unpacking once the kids were out of earshot. Mike turned to me, his face grim. Sarah, that's definitely a camera. And I bet it's not the only one. My mind raced. We need to check the whole house, I whispered urgently. Over the next hour, we scoured every room, trying to act normal. Whenever the kids came back inside, to our horror, we found cameras in every bedroom, the bathroom, even the living room. They were well hidden in light fixtures behind vents tucked into the corners of bookshelves. Whoever had placed them knew what they were doing. We have to leave, I said, my voice shaking. Right now, Mike nodded, but as he turned to call the kids, we heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside. Someone was coming up the driveway. Panic surged through me. The kids, I hissed. Get the kids. Mike rushed downstairs while I peered out the window. A battered pickup truck had pulled up, and a man was getting out. He was tall and lean, with a weathered face and cold eyes that seemed to look right through me, even from a distance. This had to be the owner, the man I'd been corresponding with about the rental. I hurried downstairs to find Mike ushering Jack and Emma towards the back door. We're going on a little adventure, he was saying, his voice forcefully cheerful. Through the woods, won't that be fun? A loud knock at the front door made us all jump. Hello, a gruff voice called out. Anyone home? Just wanted to check if you folks got settled in. All right, I met Mike's eyes, seeing my own fear reflected. There, take them, I whispered. I'll distract him. Mom, what's going on? Jack asked his earlier excitement replaced by confusion and worry. I forced a smile. Everything's fine, honey. Dad's going to take you on a hike while I chat with the owner. I'll catch up soon. Okay, another knock, louder this time. I know you're in there. Come on out, let's have a talk. Mike hesitated for a moment, then nodded grimly. He led the kids out the back door as I took a deep breath and approached the front. I opened the door, pasting on my best confused but friendly smile. Hi there, sorry about that. We were just exploring the property. You must be Mr. Jenkins. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, but his lips curled into what I suppose was meant to be a welcoming smile. It didn't reach his eyes. That's right, thought I'd stop by, make sure everything's to your liking. He peered past me into the cabin. Where's the rest of your family? I waved vaguely towards the back of the house. Oh, my husband took the kids to explore the woods. You know how it is, cooped up in the car all day. They needed to burn off some energy. Mr. Jenkins nodded slowly. Right, well, mind if I come in? Just want to check that everything's working properly. Every instinct screamed at me to slam the door in his face, but I knew I needed to buy Mike and the kids more time, so I stepped aside, letting him enter. As he moved through the cabin, I noticed him glancing at the hidden camera locations. My skin crawled as I realized he was checking to make sure they were still in place. So he said, casually, running a hand along the kitchen counter. Find everything all right? No problems. I shook my head, trying to keep my voice steady. No, everything's great. You have a lovely place here. He turned to face me, and the pretense of friendliness dropped from his expression. Is that so? Then why were you and your husband looking for my cameras? My heart stopped. He knew somehow. He knew before I could react. He was across the room, his hand closing around my throat. Where are they? He snarled. Where did you send them? I clawed at his hand, gasping for air. I don't know what you're talking about. I managed to choke out. He released me and I collapsed to the floor, coughing and sputtering. Don't play dumb with me, he growled. I saw your husband leading them out back, but that's all right. A chilling smile spread across his face. They won't get far. Not out there. Terror gripped me as I realized what he was implying. The woods, they weren't safe. Why? I gasped, struggling to my feet. Why are you doing this? His eyes gleamed with a manic light. You people come up here thinking you can just disconnect from the world, but you don't understand. The world doesn't want you to disconnect. It wants to watch, and I provide that service. I felt sick. How many families had he trapped here? How many lives had he destroyed for his twisted voyeurism? Now, he said, pulling a hunting knife from his belt. You're going to call your family back, tell them everything's fine, and then we're all going to have a nice long stay here. Understand? I nodded slowly, my mind racing. I had to find a way out of this, had to warn Mike and the kids somehow. As Mr. Jenkins reached for his phone, I saw my chance. I lunged for the knife in his other hand, catching him off guard. We grappled, the blade flashing between us. I felt a sharp pain in my arm, but adrenaline kept me fighting. Somehow, miraculously, I managed to wrench the knife from his grasp. Without hesitating, I plunged it into his shoulder. He howled in pain and fury, staggering back. I didn't wait to see if he'd stay down. I ran out the back door into the woods. I could hear him crashing through the cabin behind me, cursing and shouting threats, but I didn't look back. I just ran. The forest was dense, branches whipping at my face as I pushed through. I had no idea where Mike and the kids had gone, no idea if they were safe or if Jenkins had accomplice out here looking for them. As I ran, I shouted their names, praying they would hear me, praying Jenkins wouldn't catch up. First my lungs burned and the cut on my arm throbbed, but I pushed on. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I heard it, faint at first, then louder, Mike's voice calling my name. I changed direction, following the sound, and then finally I saw them. Mike, Jack, and Emma huddled behind a large fallen tree. Sarah, Mike cried, rushing towards me. Oh God, you're bleeding. What happened? Between gasps I explained about Jenkins, about the cameras, about his sick service. Mike's face hardened. We need to get out of here now. My cell phone started working about a mile back. I called the police. They're on their way. I nearly cried with relief. Let's go, I said. Let's go home. As we made our way out of the woods, guided by Mike's phone GPS, I held Emma's hand tight. Jack walked close to my other side, his earlier bravado replaced by a wary vigilance that broke my heart. We emerged from the forest just as police cars came roaring up the road to the cabin. The next few hours were a blur of statements and Questions of paramedics treating my arm and checking the kids for any injuries. Jenkins was caught trying to flee in his truck. The police found evidence of his crimes, not just the cameras, but hard drives full of footage, lists of past guests. It was worse than we could have imagined. As we finally drove away from that nightmare cabin, I looked at my family, shaken but safe. We had come so close to becoming another entry in Jenkins' twisted collection, but we had escaped. We had survived. The woods fell away behind us as we headed home, and I vowed that our next family vacation would be to a very crowded, very public beach. Sometimes disconnecting from the world isn't all it's cracked up to be. Sometimes it's the connections we have to each other to help when we need it that save us in the end. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the first flakes of an unexpected snowstorm. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, squinting into the gathering darkness. This wasn't how my solo hiking trip was supposed to go. As the temperature dropped and visibility worsened, I realized I had a choice to make: risk freezing in my tent or seek shelter in the dilapidated cabin I'd spotted just off the trail. Little did I know the true danger wasn't the storm, but was, or who was, waiting for me behind that weathered wooden door. My name is Alex, and I've always prided myself on being an experienced hiker. I'd spent months planning this trip through the Appalachian wilderness, meticulously mapping my route and packing all the necessary gear. But even the most prepared adventurer can be caught off guard by Mother Nature's whims. I'd been on the trail for 4 days when the storm hit. It came out of nowhere, transforming the crisp autumn air into a biting snowfill gale in a matter of hours. As I trudged through the deepening snow, I spotted the cabin, a dark silhouette against the white landscape. Approaching the structure, I could see it had seen better days. The roof sagged ominously, and several windows were boarded up, but beggars can't be choosers, and right now any shelter looked like paradise compared to the alternative. I raised my gloved hand and knocked on the door, more out of habit than expectation. To my surprise, it swung open almost immediately. "Well, ain't you a sight for sore eyes?" drawled a growly voice from within. "Come on in, for you freeze to death out there blinking away snowflakes." I stepped inside. The cabin was dimly lit by a crackling fireplace, casting long shadows across the cluttered room, and there, illuminated by the flickering flames, stood my unexpected host. He was tall and rail-thin, with a wild mane of gray hair and a beard that reached nearly to his waist. His eyes, deep-set and intense, seemed to bore right through me. "Thank you," I stammered, brushing snow from my clothes. "I didn't think anyone lived out here." The old man chuckled, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "Most don't. Name's Jeremiah. Been up here longer than I care to remember." "I'm Alex," I replied, still a bit wary, but grateful for the warmth. "I hope I'm not intruding. This storm caught me by surprise." Jeremiah waved a gnarled hand, dismissively. "Nonsense, can't leave a fellow traveler out in the cold. Can I make yourself at home?" As I settled in, hanging my wet jacket by the fire, I took in more details of the cabin. Every surface was covered with an eclectic array of objects: old books, animal skulls, jars filled with unidentifiable contents. The walls were plastered with newspaper clippings and hand-drawn maps. Jeremiah busied himself in the small kitchen area, returning with 2 steaming mugs. "Here," he said, handing me one, "my own special brew. Warm you right up." I took a cautious sip. The liquid was bitter and earthy, with an aftertaste I couldn't quite place, but it did indeed spread warmth through my body almost instantly. As the night wore on, Jeremiah proved to be quite the storyteller. He regaled me with tales of his life in the mountains, encounters with bears, hidden caves filled with crystals, and legends of lost hikers who never found their way home. "You know," he said, leaning in conspiratorially, "these mountains have secrets, things that city folk like yourself wouldn't understand." I nodded politely, but a sense of unease began to creep over me. Maybe it was the strange changed tea, or the way the shadows seemed to dance at the edges of my vision, but something felt off. "What kind of secrets?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Jeremiah's eyes gleamed in the firelight. "Ancient things, powerful things, the kind of things that can change a person if they're willing." I laughed nervously. "Sounds like something out of a horror movie." His expression darkened for a moment, then he broke into a wide grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Oh, I Assure you it's all too real, it's all too, but enough of it, you must be exhausted, why don't you get some rest? Storms likely to last through the night. He showed me to a small back room with a narrow cut. Despite my growing discomfort, exhaustion won out. I was asleep almost as soon as my head hit the pillow. I woke with a start, disoriented in the unfamiliar darkness. For a moment I couldn't remember where I was. Then it all came rushing back. The storm, the cabin, Jeremiah. Something had woken me, but I wasn't sure what. I lay still, straining my ears. There a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere in the cabin. Slowly, carefully, I got up and crept to the door. Peeking out, I saw Jeremiah hunched over a table, muttering to himself as he scribbled furiously in a large leather-bound book. Yes, yes, he was saying, his voice filled with a fervor I hadn't heard before. Finally, after all these years, the stars are aligned. The sacrifice is here. A chill ran down my spine. Sacrifice, surely I had misheard. I must have made a sound, because Jeremiah's head snapped up. Our eyes met, and in that moment I knew I was in danger. Well now, he said, his voice eerily calm, looks like our guest is up and about. Couldn't sleep. I backed away as he stood, noticing for the first time the knife clutched in his hand. It wasn't a normal hunting knife, but something ornate and ancient looking. Its blade dark was what I prayed wasn't blood. Look, I stammered, I appreciate your hospitality, but I think I should go. The storm seems to have up. Jeremiah advanced slowly like a predator stalking its prey. Oh, I'm afraid I can't let you do that, Alex. You see, you're an important part of tonight's ceremony. The entities that dwell in these mountains, they require payment for their power, and you, my friend, are that payment. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. But Jeremiah knew the layout of the cabin far better than I did. He cut me off before I could reach the front door. Now, he cried, there's no need to make this difficult. It's an honor. Really, your sacrifice will usher in a new age of power. I looked around frantically for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself. My eyes fell on a heavy iron poker by the fireplace. I lunged for it just as Jeremiah rushed at me with the knife. We grappled, the knife coming perilously close to my throat. I managed to get a hand on the poker and swung it wildly. There was a sickening crunch as it connected with Jeremiah's skull. He staggered back, blood streaming down his face, but to my horror he started laughing, a high maniacal sound that seemed to echo through the cabin. You fool, he cackled, you think you can stop what's already been set in motion? The entities are coming, they're hungry, and they will be fed. As if in response to his words, the cabin began to shake. The fireplace roared to life, flames leaping impossibly high. The air grew thick and heavy, and I could have sworn I heard whispers in a language no human throat could produce. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran for the door, wrenching it open and plunging into the snow-covered night. The storm had indeed passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed into an alien world of snow and shadows. I ran blindly, not caring which direction, just needing to put as much distance between myself and that cabin as possible. Behind me I heard Jeremiah's voice raised in a chant, growing fainter as I fled deeper into the woods, but the whispers I'd heard in the cabin seemed to follow me, growing louder with each step. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. Finally, I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath as I looked back the way I'd come. My blood ran cold. There in the distance I could see the cabin. It was engulfed in an unnatural green fire that seemed to reach toward the sky, and silhouetted against that otherworldly blaze were shapes, massive rising forms that hurt my eyes to look at directly. I turned away and started running again, no longer feeling the cold or the exhaustion. I ran until the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, not daring to stop or look back again. When I finally stumbled onto a main trail and found other hikers I was babbling incoherently about old men and sacrifices and impossible creatures. They assumed I was suffering from hypothermia and called for an emergency evacuation. I never told the full story to the authorities, who would believe me. Sometimes I wonder if it was all a hallucination brought on by the storm and exhaustion, but in my darkest moments, when the wind howls outside my window, I can still hear those unearthly whispers. I don't hike alone anymore, and I never ever accept hospitality from strangers in the wilderness. Some secrets I've learned are better left undiscovered, and some entities should remain unnamed and unfed. The acrid smell of burning rubber assaulted my nostrils as smoke billowed from under the hood of my car. I coasted to a stop on the dusty shoulder of the road, the last sputtering gasps of the engine fading into an eerie silence. As I stepped out onto the sun-baked asphalt, I realized I was stranded in the middle of nowhere with nothing but miles of cornfields stretching out on either side. Little did I know my car trouble was about to become the least of my worries in this seemingly idyllic rural town. My name's Jamie, and I was on my way to my cousin's wedding in Chicago when my trust old Corolla decided to give up the ghost. I'm usually pretty good with cars, but as I popped the hood and peered inside, I knew this was beyond my abilities to fix. The nearest town, according to my GPS, was only a few miles down the road. Silver lining I thought. I grabbed my backpack, locked the car, and started walking. The summer sun beat down mercilessly, and I could feel sweat beginning to soak through my t-shirt. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 45 minutes, I saw the first signs of civilization. A faded welcome sign proclaiming "Welcome to Millbrook, where everyone knows your name." As I entered the town, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The streets were eerily quiet for a weekday afternoon. The few people I did see seemed to stop and stare as I passed by, their eyes following me with an unsettling intensity. One spotted a gas station and made a beeline for it, hoping to find a mechanic or at least a phone I could use to call for a tow. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully as I entered, a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere inside. Behind the counter stood an old man, his weathered face creased with deep lines. He regarded me with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Afternoon," I said, trying to sound friendly. "My car broke down a few miles back. Is there a mechanic in town who could take a look at it?" The old man's eyes narrowed slightly. "Broke down, you say? That's a shame. Old Joe used to be our mechanic, but he left town a while back. Never did find a replacement." Something in the way he said "left town" sent a shiver down my spine. "Oh," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Well, is there a place I could stay tonight? I can try to figure out the car situation." In the morning. The old man seemed to consider this for a moment. "Millie runs a boarding house just down the street. She might have a room for you, but listen here, stranger." He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Don't go asking too many questions. You hear folks around here, they don't take kindly to outsiders poking their noses where they don't belong." I nodded, not quite sure how to respond to that ominous warning. As I turned to leave, the old man called out, "Oh, and make sure you're indoors by sundown. It's not safe to be out after dark." The walk to Mill's boarding house was short, but it felt like every eye in town was on me. Curtains twitched in windows as I passed, and the few people on the street gave me a wide berth. Millie turned out to be a plump, matronly woman with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She showed me to a small, musty room on the second floor. "Dinner's at 6 sharp," she said. "Don't be late, and don't leave your room after that. House rules." As the door closed behind her, I sat on the creaky bed, my mind racing. What kind of town had I stumbled into? Why was everyone so secretive and paranoid? I decided to do some exploring before dinner, hoping to find someone who could give me a straight answer about getting my car fixed. As I walked down Main Street, I noticed something strange. There were no children anywhere, no playgrounds, no sounds of laughter, nothing to indicate that anyone under the age of 30 lived in Millbrook. I approached a woman watering flowers outside a quaint little house. "Excuse me," I said, "I'm new in town," and before I could finish, she dropped her watering can and hurried inside, slamming the door behind her. I stood there stunned, water seeping into my sneakers. A hand clamped down on my shoulder, making me jump. I turned to see a tall man in a sheriff's uniform, his face set in a grim expression. "You're causing quite a stir, stranger," he said, his tone cold. "Why don't you come down to the station with me? We need to have a little chat." My heart raced as I followed him to a small brick building with sheriff's office painted on the door. Inside, he motioned for me to sit in a hard wooden chair across from his desk. "Now then," he said, leaning back in his chair, "why don't you tell me what brings you to our little town?" I explained about my car trouble, trying to keep my voice from shaking. As I spoke, I noticed a board on the wall behind him covered in missing person flyers, most of them were yellowed with age, but a few looked recent. The sheriff followed my gaze and quickly stood up, moving to block my view of the board. Car trouble, huh? He said, his voice dripping with skepticism. And I suppose you'll be leaving as soon as it's fixed? I nodded eagerly. Yes, sir, I'm actually on my way to a wedding in Chicago. I don't want to be any trouble. He studied me for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. All right, here's what's going to happen. You're going to go back to Millie's, have your dinner, and stay in your room. Tomorrow morning I'll personally drive you back to your car, and give you a tow to the next town over. You get your car fixed there, and you never come back to Millbrook. Understood? I agreed, relieved to have a way out of this strange situation. As I stood to leave, the sheriff added, and remember, stay inside after dark, no matter what you hear, no matter what you see. Do not leave that boarding house for your own safety. Back at Millie's, dinner was a quiet, tense affair. The other boarders, all older folks, barely spoke, just shoveled food into their mouths. With quick, nervous movements, I tried to make conversation, but was met with monosyllabic responses and averted gazes. As I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something crucial. What was everyone so afraid of? Why were there so many missing person reports in such a small town around midnight? I heard it, a low, mournful howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was followed by screams, distant but unmistakable. I rushed to the window, my curiosity overriding my fear. What I saw in the street below made my blood run cold. People, if you could call them that, were shambling down the road. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, and even from a distance I could see that their eyes glowed an eerie phosphorescent green. As I watched in horror, one of these creatures grabbed a man who had foolishly ventured outside the victims. Screams were cut short as the thing literally began to devour him. I stumbled back from the window, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of nightmare. A soft knock at my door made me jump. Jamie, it was Millie's voice, barely above a whisper. I know you're awake. I know what you've seen. If you want answers, meet me in the basement, but be quiet. And for God's sake, don't let them see you. Heart pounding, I followed Millie down creaky stairs to a dimly lit basement. A small group of people were gathered there, including the gas station owner and a few of the dinner guests. We don't have much time, Millie said, her earlier fake cheerfulness replaced by grim determination. Those things out there, they used to be our neighbors, our friends, our children. It started about a year ago. People began to change, to turn into those monsters. We don't know why or how, but it spreads like a disease. The gas station owner chimed in. We've been trying to keep it contained to keep outsiders from finding out or getting infected, but it's getting worse. More people turn every night. I struggled to process this information. But why don't you leave, get help? A bitter laugh came from one of the dinner guests. Leave? There's no leaving Millbrook. Those things, they hunt down anyone who tries to escape, and the government, they've quarantined us. Shoot on sight if anyone tries to cross the town line. Suddenly, the sheriff's insistence on driving me to the next town made horrible sense. He wasn't helping me, he was making sure I didn't spread whatever this was to the outside world. So what do we do? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and resolve. We fight, we try to find a cure, and we pray that one day we'll wake up and this nightmare will be over. As the sounds of inhuman howls and all too human screams filtered down from above, I realized my simple car trouble had led me into a horror beyond imagination. And as the night wore on, one thought kept repeating in my mind. In Millbrook, where everyone knows your name, some names are best left forgotten. The sound of chanting filled the air, a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to pulse through the very ground beneath my feet. I stood at the edge of the clearing, watching as dozens of people swayed in unison, their eyes closed and faces upturned to the star-filled sky. This wasn't what I had signed up for when I joined the Enlightened Path retreat. As the chanting grew louder and more frenzied, a chill ran down my spine. I had a sinking feeling that this seemingly peaceful spiritual getaway was about to take a very dark turn. My name is Maya, and just a week ago I was a stressed-out marketing executive, desperately seeking some peace and clarity in my life, when I stumbled across an ad for the Enlightened Path retreat promising a week of Meditation, nature walks, and self-discovery. In the lush forests of Oregon, it seemed like exactly what I needed. The first few days were everything I had hoped for. Our group of about 20 participants spent our mornings in guided meditation sessions led by Martin, our serene and soft-spoken guide. Afternoons were filled with nature hikes and workshops on mindfulness and inner peace. In the evenings, we gathered around a campfire sharing our experiences and insights. I felt myself beginning to unwind the tension of my everyday life, melting away in this tranquil setting. But as the week progressed, I started to notice subtle changes in the atmosphere of the retreat. Martin's teachings began to take on a more esoteric tone, filled with references to cosmic energies and ancient wisdom that only he seemed to fully understand. I also couldn't help but notice the way some of the other participants looked at him with an adoration that bordered on worship. On the fourth night, things took a decidedly strange turn. After dinner, Martin announced that we would be participating in a special ceremony to align our energies with the universe. He produced a small vial of liquid, explaining that it was a sacred elixir passed down through generations of spiritual masters. This will open your minds to truths beyond your wildest imagination, he said, his eyes gleaming with an intensity one hadn't seen before. Who among you is ready to transcend the limitations of your earthly existence? To my astonishment, most of the group eagerly lined up to receive a drop of the mysterious liquid on their tongues. I hung back, a knot of unease forming in my stomach. Something about this didn't feel right. Martin's eyes found mine in the crowd. Maya, he said, his voice gentle but insistent, don't you want to join us on this journey to enlightenment? I mumbled an excuse about not feeling well and slipped away to my tent, my mind racing. What was in that liquid, and what did Martin mean by transcending earthly existence? Sleep eluded me that night. I tossed and turned, straining my ears for any unusual sounds from the camp. Just before dawn, I heard it, the chanting that had led me to the edge of the clearing where I now stood, watching in growing horror as the ceremony unfolded. Martin stood in the center of the group, his arms raised to the sky. Gone was the calm, soft-spoken guide of the past few days. His eyes blazed with a fanatical light, and his voice boomed across the clearing as he led the chant in a language I didn't recognize. I scanned the faces of my fellow retreat-goers. Their expressions were blank, almost trance-like, as they swayed and chanted. What had that elixir done to them? Suddenly Martin's voice cut through the chanting. Brothers and sisters, he cried, the moment of our ascension is at hand. The cosmic gates are opening, ready to receive our liberated souls. A murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd. I watched in disbelief as Martin produced a large knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight. To free our spirits from their earthly shells, we must make the ultimate sacrifice, he intoned. Who among you will be the first to shed their mortal coil and embrace eternal enlightenment? To my horror, several people stepped forward, eager volunteers for what was clearly about to become a mass suicide. I had to do something, but what I was vastly outnumbered, and everyone seemed to be under Martin's spell. As Martin raised the knife of preparing to claim his first victim, I did the only thing I could think of. I screamed. The sound shattered the rhythmic chanting, causing several people to snap out of their trance-like state and look around in confusion. Martin's head whipped towards me, his eyes narrowing in anger. Seize her, he shouted. She seeks to prevent our glorious ascension. I turned and ran crashing through the underbrush as I heard pursuit behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I dodged trees and leapt over fallen logs. The sounds of the chaos I'd left behind faded into the distance. I had no idea where I was going in the pre-dawn darkness, enum, but I knew I had to find help after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. I burst out of the forest onto a narrow road. In the distance, I saw headlights approaching. Waving my arms frantically, I ran towards the vehicle. It was an old pickup truck, driven by a startled-looking older man. Please, I gasped as he rolled down his window. You have to help me. There's a cult back there in the woods. They're trying to kill themselves. The man's eyes widened in alarm. Hopped in, he said, reaching over to unlock the passenger door. There's a ranger station a few miles down the road. We can call for help from there. As we sped towards the ranger station, I filled him in on what had happened at the retreat. He shook His head in disbelief. I've lived in these parts for 40 years, he said, and I've seen all sorts of strange groups come and go in these woods, but this is something else. At the ranger station we were met with initial skepticism, but the urgency in my voice must have convinced them, because soon a fleet of police cars and ambulances were racing towards the retreat site. I led the authorities back to the clearing, my heart in my throat as I wondered what we would find. The scene that greeted us was one of confusion and despair. Some of the retreat participants were wandering aimlessly, looking dazed and disoriented. Others were sobbing uncontrollably. To my relief, there were no bodies. We had arrived in time to prevent the worst from happening, but Martin was nowhere to be found. He had vanished into the woods, taking his deadly ideology with him in the days that followed as the police investigated, and the survivors were treated for the effects of whatever drug had been in that sacred elixir. I struggled to come to terms with what had happened. How had a simple spiritual retreat turned into such a nightmare? I learned that Martin, whose real name was Gerald Kovat, had a history of founding and abandoning cults across the country. He preyed on people like me, stressed out urbanites looking for meaning and peace in their lives, gradually indoctrinating them into his twisted belief system. The enlightened path had been his most ambitious project yet, and if I hadn't raised the alarm when I did, it would have ended in tragedy. The thought of how close we had come to mass suicide still gives me chills as I prepared to return home. One of the other survivors approached me. Her name was Lisa, and the haunted look in her eyes mirrored what I felt inside. Thank you, she said quietly. If you hadn't stopped it. She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. I nodded, understanding the weight of what had almost happened. I'm just glad I trusted my instincts, I replied. When something feels wrong, it usually is. Lisa managed a weak smile. I guess we both learned that the hard way. What are you going to do now? I thought about it for a moment. The experience had shaken me to my core, but it had also shown me the danger of blindly following someone else's path to enlightenment. I'm going to find my own way, I said finally. No gurus, no retreats, just me figuring out what really matters in life. As I boarded my flight home, I couldn't help but think about Martin, still out there somewhere, possibly planning his next cult. I shuddered at the thought of other unsuspecting people falling into his trap. The enlightened path retreat had promised to change my life, and in a way it had, just not in the way I had expected. I left those woods with a newfound appreciation for critical thinking and the importance of trusting my own judgment. The search for meaning and peace is a deeply personal journey, I realized, and sometimes the most enlightened path is the one you forge for yourself. The scalpel glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights, its edge unnaturally sharp. Dr. Carlson's hand trembled slightly as he lowered it towards the creature strapped to the table. I watched in horror, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't research, it was torture. And I was the only one who could stop it. My name is Emily, and 3 months ago, I was thrilled to land an internship at the prestigious Oceanic Research Institute on a remote island in the Pacific. As a marine biology student, it was a dream come true to work alongside Dr. James Carlson, a renowned expert in deep-sea ecosystems. His groundbreaking work had always inspired me, and I couldn't wait to learn from him. The island was small, barely a speck on the map, with only the research station and a few support buildings. Our team was compact. Dr. Carlson, his assistant Sarah, the station manager Tom, and myself. The isolation was intense, but the potential for discovery made it all worthwhile. At first everything was exactly as I'd hoped. We spent our days analyzing water samples, cataloging species, and conducting experiments on the unique marine life found in the surrounding waters. Dr. Carlson was brilliant, if a bit intense, always pushing us to look deeper, to question everything we thought we knew about ocean ecosystems. It was about a month into my internship when things started to change. Dr. Carlson became sensitive, spending long hours locked in his private lab. He was irritable and evasive when asked about his work. I noticed Sarah and Tom exchanging worried glances, but neither would say anything when I asked what was wrong. One night, unable to sleep due to the oppressive heat, I decided to take a walk around the station. As I passed by Dr. Carlson's lab, I heard strange noises coming from inside, a sort of chittering sound I'd never heard before, followed by what sounded like muffled cursing. Curiosity got the better of me. I knew I shouldn't, but I used my key card to enter the lab. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. Tanks lined the walls filled with creatures I'd never seen before. They were vaguely humanoid, but clearly not human, with elongated limbs, webbed fingers, and large bulbous eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. Some looked injured. Others were unnaturally still, and there in the center of the room was Dr. Carlson. He was hunched over an examination table, scalpel in hand, operating on one of the creatures. The being was clearly in pain, its chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. I must have made a sound because Dr. Carlson whirled around, his eyes wide, with a mixture of anger and fear. "Emily, what are you doing here?" he snapped, moving to lock my view of the table. I heard noises, I stammered. "Dr. Carlson, Fox, what is this? What are those things?" he sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "You weren't supposed to see this, not yet, but since you're here," he gestured for me to come closer. Against my better judgment, I approached the table. The creature's eyes locked onto mine, and I saw intelligence there, along with unmistakable pain and fear. "We discovered them about 6 months ago," Drive Carlson explained, his voice taking on the excited tone he used when discussing his research, a previously unknown species living in the deepest parts of the ocean. "They're intelligent, Emily, possibly as intelligent as humans. Can you imagine what we can learn from them?" I felt sick, but this isn't research. "You're torturing them." Dr. Carlson's expression hardened. "Sometimes sacrifices must be made. In the name of science, think of the advancements we could make, medical breakthroughs, new technologies based on their biology. The potential is limitless." I shook my head, backing away. "This is wrong. We need to stop this. Report it to the authorities." "I'm afraid I can't let you do that," he said, his voice cold. Before I could react, he grabbed my arm, his grip painfully tight. "You're part of this now, Emily. You'll see in time. You'll understand the importance of what we're doing here." He locked me in one of the storage rooms, promising to deal with me in the morning. As I sat in the darkness, I could hear the muffled sounds of the creatures, their cries of pain and distress. I had to do something, but what? We were isolated with no way to contact the outside world without going through the main communication center. Hours passed. Just when I was about to give up hope, the door opened. It was Sarah, her face pale and drawn. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I should have done something sooner, but we're going to make this right." She led me to the communication center, where Tom was already working on sending out a distress signal. "We've suspected for a while that something wasn't right," Sarah explained as we waited. "But Dr. Carlson, he has a way of making you believe in his vision." It wasn't until we saw how far he was willing to go that we realized we had to stop him. The next few hours were a blur. A government ship arrived along with a team of scientists and ethical oversight committee members. Dr. Carlson was taken into custody, ranting about the opportunities we were throwing away. As for the creatures, a heated debate broke out about what to do with them. Some wanted to continue the research, albeit in a more ethical manner. Others argued for their immediate release back into the ocean. In the end, a compromise was reached. The injured creatures would be cared for and studied in a specially designed facility with strict ethical guidelines in place. Once healed, they would be released. The others were set free, immediately disappearing into the inky depths of the ocean. I stayed on the island for another month, helping with the cleanup and ethical review process. It was a challenging time, filled with difficult questions about the nature of scientific discovery and the responsibilities we have to the subjects of our research. On my last night on the island, I stood on the beach, watching the waves crash against the shore. I thought about the creatures we'd encountered, about the vast mysteries still hidden in the ocean depths. I thought about Dr. Carlson, a brilliant mind corrupted by ambition and the lure of discovery at any cost. As I turned to head back to the station, I saw something in the water, a face vaguely humanoid but undeniably alien, watching me from just beyond the surf. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I felt a connection I couldn't explain. Then, with a flick of a webbed hand, it was gone, leaving only ripples on the moonlit water. That experience changed me profoundly. I still love marine biology, still yearn to uncover the secrets of the ocean, but now I approach my work with a deeper understanding of the ethical implications of scientific research, I've dedicated my career to developing more humane research methods and advocating for the rights of the creatures we study. Sometimes late at night, I think about those intelligent eyes looking up at me from the examination table. I wonder if the creatures remember us, if they tell stories about the strange surface dwellers who captured and then freed them. I hope that if we ever encounter them again, it will be on better terms, as equals, each with something to learn from the other. The ocean is vast and full of wonders, but as I learned on that remote island, the greatest discoveries are the ones that challenge us to be better, not just as scientists, but as human beings. The ethical path may not always be the easiest, but it's the only one that allows us to look at ourselves in the mirror and be proud of what we see. As I boarded the ship that would take me back to the mainland, I took one last look at the island. The research station stood silent, its secrets now exposed to the light of day. I didn't know what the future held, but I was determined to use what I'd learned here to make a difference. The ocean had shown me its darkest depths, but also its capacity for wonder and redemption. It was up to me to honor that lesson in everything I did. From that moment on, the click of a rifle safety being disengaged cut through the stillness of the night. I froze my hand. Halfway to the door handle of my van, shadows moved in the darkness surrounding me, and I realized with a sickening jolt that I was completely surrounded. What had started as a peaceful night of stealth camping in the wilderness had suddenly turned into a life or death situation. My name is Alex, and up until that moment I'd considered myself something of an expert in van life and stealth camping. I'd spent the last 2 years crisscrossing the country in my converted Sprinter van, seeking out the most remote and beautiful spots to spend my nights. I prided myself on my ability to find secluded areas where I could park unnoticed and wake up to breathtaking views. This particular night, I'd found what I thought was the perfect spot deep in a national forest. It was miles from the nearest marked campground, accessible only by a narrow, rutted fire road that I'd barely managed to navigate in my van. The clearing I'd parked in was surrounded by towering pines, their branches creating a natural canopy that would hide me from any passing aircraft. I'd spent a pleasant evening cooking dinner on my portable stove, enjoying the absolute silence that can only be found in places this remote. As night fell, I settled into my van, cracking open a book and looking forward to a peaceful night's sleep. It was around midnight when I first heard it, the faint sound of engines in the distance. At first I didn't think much of it, maybe some other campers had found a spot nearby, but as the sound grew closer I felt a flutter of unease in my stomach. Something about the way the vehicles were moving quickly and purposefully didn't seem right. I peered out my window, straining to see in the darkness. That's when I spotted the first flashlight beam cutting through the trees, then another and another. Within minutes my secluded clearing was surrounded by what looked like a small army. Heart-pounding, I weighed my options. Should I start the van and try to make a run for it? No, the road was too narrow and rough. I'd never make it past them. Should I announce my presence, try to explain that I was just a harmless camper? But if these people were up to something illegal that could be a death sentence in the end, panic and self-preservation won out. I decided to stay quiet and hope they'd move on without noticing me. I killed the small light I'd been using to read and held my breath, praying my dark-colored van would blend into the shadows. For a while it seemed to work. I could hear them moving around the clearing, talking in low voices. They seemed to be unloading equipment from their vehicles, but I couldn't make out what. Just when I thought I might get away with it, disaster struck. My phone, which I'd forgotten to silence, let out a loud ping, a text message notification. In the stillness of the night it might as well have been a gunshot. Everything went quiet for a moment, then a gruff voice called out, "Who's there? Come out now." I knew the game was up. With trembling hands I reached for the door handle, ready to step out and face whatever was waiting for me. That's when I heard the click of the rifle and my blood ran cold. "I'm coming out," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm unarmed, please don't shoot." Slowly I opened the van door and stepped out into the clearing, my hands raised above my head. The scene that greeted me was like something Out of a movie, at least a dozen men, all armed, stood in a loose circle around my van behind them. I could see several large trucks, their headlights illuminating stacks of crates and equipment. One man stepped forward, presumably the leader. He was tall and muscular with a face that looked like it had seen its fair share of fights. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What are you doing here?" "My name's Alex," I said, my mouth dry with fear. "I'm just a camper. I didn't mean to intrude on whatever this is. If you let me go, I swear I won't say a word to anyone." The leader's eyes narrowed. "You expect us to believe you just happened to camp in this exact spot on this exact night in the middle of nowhere?" I nodded frantically. "It's what I do. I travel around finding remote places to camp. I swear I had no idea anyone else would be here. I'm not a cop or a ranger or anything like that." He studied me for a long moment, then turned to one of his men, searched the van, every inch of it. I stood there shivering in the cool night air. As they tore through my home on wheels, they pulled out all my belongings, rifled through my clothes, checked every hidden compartment I'd built for storage. I winced as I heard things breaking, but I didn't dare protest. After what felt like hours, but was probably only about 20 minutes, the man who'd been searching my van approached the leader. "It's clean, boss. Just camping gear and personal stuff. No weapons, no radio equipment, nothing suspicious." The leader turned back to me, his expression unreadable. "Looks like you might be telling the truth after all, but that still leaves us with a problem. You've seen too much." My heart sank. This was it. They were going to kill me and dump my body in the woods. No one would ever know what happened to me. But then, to my surprise, the leader's face softened slightly. "I've got kids about your age," he said, his voice gruff, but not unkind. "I'd hate for them to disappear without a trace. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to get in your van and drive away. You're going to keep driving until sunrise. You're not going to stop. You're not going to call anyone. And you're sure as hell not going to come back here. If I ever see your face or this van again, I won't be so understanding." "Got it," I nodded vigorously, hardly daring to believe my luck. "Yes, sir. Thank you. I promise you'll never see me again." He gestured to his men, and they started tossing my belongings back into the van haphazard. Within minutes, I was behind the wheel, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key in the ignition as I started to pull away. The leader approached my window one last time. "Remember," he said, his voice low and menacing, "if you breathe a word of this to anyone, we'll find you, and next time we won't be so forgiving." I nodded mutely and put the van in gear as I navigated the treacherous fire road. In the dark, my mind was reeling. What had I stumbled upon? Drug smuggler's gun, RERS, some kind of militia? I didn't know, and I didn't want to know. True to my word, I drove until sunrise, not daring to stop even when my eyelids grew heavy and my gas tank neared empty. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, I finally pulled into a truck stop, my whole body shaking with exhaustion and leftover adrenaline. That night changed me. I still love the freedom of van life, still seek out beautiful and remote places, but I'm more cautious now. I always make sure someone knows where I am, and I've installed a panic button that can send out my GPS coordinates in an emergency. Sometimes on quiet nights, when I'm parked in some isolated spot, I find myself straining to hear the sound of approaching engines. The memory of those armed men surrounding my van still haunts my dreams, but mostly I'm grateful to be alive, grateful for the second chance I was given, and while part of me still wonders what exactly I stumbled upon that night, a bigger part knows that some questions are better left unanswered. In the vast wilderness of this country, there are secrets hidden in the shadows. And sometimes the wisest thing to do is to keep driving and never look back. The sun dipped below the mountain peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. I should have been struck by the beauty, but all I could focus on was the growing knot of dread in my stomach with each step deeper into the wilderness, led by the group of hikers I'd foolishly trusted. I realized I was walking into a nightmare of my own making. My name is Lily, and just 24 hours earlier I had been an excited solo traveler eager to explore the rugged beauty of the Pacific Northwest. I'd always been the adventurous type, but usually within reason. This trip was my first real foray into solo travel, a test of my independence and a chance to push My boundaries. I'd spent the first few days of my trip in Seattle soaking up the city vibes and planning my venture into the nearby mountains. The plan was to do someday hikes, nothing too strenuous or remote. I wasn't experienced enough for serious backcountry trekking, and I knew it. On my third day I struck up a conversation with a group of hikers at my hostel. They were friendly and charismatic, especially their leader, a guy named Mike. When they invited me to join them on a hike the next day, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. Safety in numbers. Right, the next morning we set out early. The trailhead was about an hour's drive from the city, and as we got further from civilization, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. The hike started off beautifully. The forest was lush and green, the air crisp and invigorating. Mike and his friends Tom, Sarah, and Kyle seemed knowledgeable about the area and hiking in general. As we walked, they told me about a secret spot they knew off the main trail. It's a bit of a trek, Mike said, but the view is absolutely worth it. Waterfall, pristine lake, the works. Most tourists never see it. I hesitated. How far off trail is it? I'm not really equipped for anything too intense. Sarah chimed in, her voice reassuring. Oh, it's not bad at all, maybe an hour or so off the main path. We do this hike all the time. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The idea of seeing something few others had was too tempting to pass up. We veered off the marked trail around midday. At first, it wasn't too bad. There was a faint path, probably made by animals or other hikers, but as we continued, the terrain got rougher. We were climbing more, scrambling over rocks and pushing through dense underbrush. After what felt like way more than an hour, I spoke up. Guys, are you sure this is the right way? We've been going for a while now. Mike turned back to me, a strange glint in his eye that I hadn't noticed before. We're getting tired already, city girl, don't worry, we're almost there. Something in his tone made my skin crawl. I glanced at the others, hoping to see some reassurance, but their expressions had changed. Too, the friendly openness from earlier was gone, replaced by a focused, almost predatory look. That's when it hit me. I was in serious trouble. I tried to stay calm, to think rationally. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe they were just more serious about hiking than I'd realized. But as the sun began to set and we pushed deeper into increasingly wild territory, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was all very, very wrong. I think I should head back, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It's getting late, and I'm not comfortable hiking in the dark. Kyle, who had been bringing up the rear of our group, moved closer. Don't be silly, he said, his hand gripping my arm just a little too tightly. We've come this far, you don't want to miss the payoff, do you? I pulled away, my heart racing. No, really, I want to go back now. Mike turned to face me fully, dropping all pretense of friendliness. That's not an option, Lily. You're coming with us one way or another. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Panic surged through me. I turned to run, but Kyle grabbed me, his grip bruising Sarah, and Tom quickly moved to block any escape route. And why are you doing this? I cried, struggling against Kyle's hold. What do you want from me? Mike smirked, a cold, calculating expression that chilled me to the bone. Let's just say we have some friends who pay well for company, especially pretty young company like yourself. You'd be surprised how easy it is to make people disappear in places like this. The reality of my situation crashed over me like a wave. They were going to traffic me, sell me to God knows who, and no one would ever know what happened. I'd vanished without a trace, just another missing hiker in the vast wilderness. As Mike turned to lead us further into the gathering darkness, I knew I had to act. It was now or never. Summoning every ounce of strength I had, I stomped hard on Kyle's foot and threw my head back, connecting solidly with his nose. He let go with a howl of pain, and I ran. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I had to put distance between myself and my captors. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and arms behind me. I could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit. The fading light made the forest treacherous. I tripped and stumbled over roots and rocks, my lungs burning as I gasped for air, but fear kept me going, pushing me to run faster than I ever had before. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. The forest seemed endless, every tree and rock looking the same in the growing darkness. Eventually I couldn't hear my pursuers anymore, but I didn't dare stop. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I saw a glimmer of light through the trees. At first I thought I was hallucinating, But as I got closer I realized it was real, a cabin with warm light spilling from its windows. I burst into the clearing, practically falling against the cabin's door as I pounded on it with what little strength I had left. "Help," I screamed. "Please help me." The door opened, revealing an older man with a bewildered expression. "Good Lord, child, what's happened to you?" Between gasping breaths I managed to explain about the hikers, the kidnapping attempt, my escape. The man John the First learned later ushered me inside and locked the door immediately, reaching for a shotgun that hung over his fireplace. "You're safe now," he assured me, his voice gruff but kind. "Ain't nobody going to hurt you here." John, as it turned out, was a retired park ranger who lived in this remote cabin year-round. He knew every inch of these woods, and more importantly, he had a radio to call for help. The next few hours were a blur. Park rangers and local police swarmed the area. I gave my statement, described my attackers, tried to retrace my path as best I could. They found Mike and his group the next day, trying to make their way out of the forest. As it turned out, they were wanted in connection with several other disappearances in national parks across the country. As I sat in John's cabin, wrapped in a warm blanket and sipping hot tea, the reality of what I'd been through and what I'd narrowly escaped began to sink in. I broke down, sobs racking my body as the adrenaline wore off and the shock set in. John sat with me, his presence comforting in its steadiness. "You did good, kid," he said softly. "You survived, that's what matters." In the days and weeks that followed, as I gave more detailed statements and began the process of healing, I thought a lot about trust, about intuition, and about the fine line between adventure and recklessness. I had ignored my gut feelings, pushed aside my concerns in the name of politeness and not wanting to seem paranoid. Never again, I vowed I would listen to that inner voice, trust my instincts, and never let the fear of seeming rude override my sense of self-preservation. I still travel, still hike, still seek out beautiful and remote places, but I do it smarter now. I take classes in wilderness survival and self-defense. I always let someone know where I'm going and when I'll be back, and I trust my gut. If something feels off, I listen to that feeling. Sometimes when I'm on a trail and I see a solo hiker, I think about approaching them, striking up a friendly conversation, but then I remember that day in the mountains, and I keep my distance. In the wilderness, as in life, it's better to be cautious than to be a cautionary tale. The mountains taught me a harsh lesson that day, but they also showed me my own strength, my resilience, and my will to survive. For that, in a strange way, I'm grateful. Every sunrise I see now is a gift, a reminder of the day I outran the darkness and found my way back to the light. The mountain path narrowed to a treacherous ledge, barely wide enough for a single person. My new friend Marco gestured for me to go first, his smile not quite reaching his eyes as I inched along the cliff face. Heart pounding, a chilling realization washed over me. This wasn't a detour to a hidden viewpoint. This was a trap, and I had walked right into it. My name is Jess, and until that moment I thought I was living out my dream backpacking trip through South America I'd saved for years, meticulously planning each leg of my journey, but no amount of planning could have prepared me for the nightmare that was about to unfold in the Andes Mountains of Peru. I'd arrived in Cusco a week earlier, acclimatizing to the altitude and soaking in the rich culture of the ancient Incan capital. My plan was to spend a few days exploring the city before embarking on a guided track to Machu Picchu. That's when I met Marco at a local cafe. He was charming and handsome, with an easy smile and a wealth of knowledge about the area. When he mentioned he was a local guide who knew some off-the-beaten-path routes to Machu Picchu, I was intrigued. The idea of avoiding the tourist crowds and seeing the ruins in a more authentic way was tempting. It's a bit more challenging than the usual trek, Marco had said, his eyes twinkling with excitement, but the views are unbelievable and we'll have the trail almost entirely to ourselves. I hesitated, knowing it was probably smarter to stick with an official tour group, but Marco's enthusiasm was infectious, and after a few days of showing me around Cusco, I felt like I could trust him, so against my better judgment, I agreed to let him guide me on this secret trail. We set out early one morning, the air crisp and thin at the high altitude. The first few hours of the hike were challenging but exhilarating. Marco was right. The Views were breathtaking, and we hadn't seen another soul on the trail. It was around midday when things started to feel off. Marco's demeanor changed subtly, his friendly chatter tapered off, replaced by clear instructions and an increasing sense of urgency in his pace. When I asked about stopping for lunch, he brushed me off, insisting we needed to reach a certain point before taking a break. As the afternoon wore on, the trail became increasingly difficult. We were scrambling over boulders and edging along narrow ledges. My muscles ached, and a gnawing sense of unease was growing in my stomach. "Marco," I called out, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "Are you sure this is the right way? It seems really dangerous." He turned back to me, and for a split second I saw something cold and calculating in his eyes before his face settled back into a reassuring smile. "Trust me, Jess, it's just a bit further. The view at the next ridge will make it all worth it." That's when we reached the narrow ledge where I now stood, my back pressed against the cold rock face, trying not to look down at the dizzying drop below. "Go on," Marco urged from behind me. "It's perfectly safe. I've done this 100 times with no choice but to move forward." I inched along the ledge, my fingers scraped against the rough stone as I desperately sought handholds. Each step was a battle against vertigo and terror. Halfway across, I heard Marco's footsteps behind me. He was too close, crowding me on the narrow path. Before I could protest, I felt his hand on my backpack. "I'm sorry, Jess," he said, his voice devoid of the warmth it had held for the past week, "but this is where your journey ends." With a powerful shove, he pushed me off the ledge. Time seemed to slow as I fell. In that eternal moment, my life didn't flash before my eyes, instead my mind filled with a single burning regret. Why hadn't I trusted my instincts? But fate, it seemed, wasn't done with me yet. My backpack caught on a protruding rock, jerking me to a painful stop. I dangled there, the straps digging into my shoulders, my feet kicking at empty air above me. I heard Marco curse. This clearly wasn't part of his plan. I looked up to see him peering over the edge, his face a mask of frustration and anger. "Just let go," he shouted. "It'll be easier for both of us." But survival instinct had kicked in, overriding my terror. I swung my body, trying to get enough momentum to reach a small outcropping just a few feet away. Marco, realizing what I was attempting, began to dislodge rocks, sending them raining down around me. By some miracle, I managed to grab onto the outcropping with strength I didn't know I possessed. I pulled myself onto the small ledge, my arms shaking with the effort. Marco's face contorted with rage. "Fine," he spat, "have it your way. You'll die slowly up here instead." And with that, he disappeared from view. I was alive, but my situation was dire. I was stranded on a tiny ledge, hundreds of feet up a sheer cliff face, with no gear and no way to call for help. Night was falling, and with it came a bone-chilling cold. As darkness enveloped me, I huddled against the rock face, trying to conserve what little body heat I had. I thought about my family, my friends. Would they ever know what happened to me? Would my body ever be found? The night was the longest of my life. Every gust of wind threatened to dislodge me from my precarious perch. I drifted in and out of consciousness, my mind playing tricks on me in the thin air and extreme stress. As the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, I heard it, the faint thrum of a helicopter. At first I thought I was hallucinating, but as the sound grew louder, I realized it was real. Someone was looking for me. With the last of my strength, I waved my arms and shouted. The helicopter circled once, twice, and then I saw a rescuer being lowered on a winch. Within minutes, I was safely strapped in and being lifted to safety. Later, in the hospital, I learned the full story. Marco was part of a gang that preyed on solo travelers, luring them off the beaten path to rob and sometimes kill them, but he had made a crucial mistake. He had been spotted talking to me in Cusco by another traveler who recognized him from a police warning. When I didn't return from our hike, this traveler had alerted the authorities. Marco was caught trying to cross the border into Bolivia. In his possession were my stolen belongings and, chillingly, a journal detailing his previous victims. As I recovered both physically and emotionally from my ordeal, I grappled with a range of emotions: guilt for having been so naive, anger at Marco and others like him who prey on trusting travelers, and overwhelming gratitude for my second chance at life. The experience changed me profoundly. I still love to Travel still seek out adventures in far-flung corners of the world, but I do it differently now. I'm more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I trust my instincts implicitly. That little voice of doubt that I ignored with Marco now gets my full attention. Most importantly, I've learned that true adventure doesn't come from taking unnecessary risks or trusting strangers too quickly. It comes from opening yourself up to new experiences while staying true to your own inner compass. I did eventually make it to Machu Picchu, this time with a reputable tour group. As I stood looking out over the ancient ruins, I felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over me. Every step of that official trail, every breath of the thin mountain air was a gift, a reminder of how close I came to never seeing this wonder at all. My brush with death in the Andes taught me that life is precious and fragile. It showed me the darkest side of humanity, yes, but also the incredible resilience of the human spirit, and it reminded me that sometimes the most important journey we can take is the one that leads us back to ourselves. Now, when I meet fellow travelers and they ask about the long scar on my arm, a souvenir from my fall, I tell them my story not to scare them, but to remind them to trust themselves, to be aware, and to remember that while the world is full of incredible experiences and mostly good people, it's okay to be cautious, because sometimes that caution might just save your life. The glint of moonlight on the knife's blade caught my eye, and my blood ran cold. My uncle's hand trembled as he poured the clear liquid into Grandpa's bedside water glass. In that moment I realized the family reunion I'd been looking forward to for months had just turned into a fight to save my grandfather's life. I'm Sarah, and until that night I thought I knew my family inside and out. We were the Thompsons, loud, loving, and always ready for a good time. Our annual family reunion at Grandpa's lakeside cabin was the highlight of my year. A week of swimming, barbecues, and catching up with relatives from all over the country this year was extra special. It was Grandpa's 80th birthday, and everyone had made the effort to be there. The cabin was packed to the rafters. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and second cousins, twice removed, were crammed into every available space. The air was filled with laughter, the smell of home cooking, and the excited chatter of family members who hadn't seen each other in far too long. Grandpa was in his element, holding court from his favorite armchair, regaling us with stories we'd all heard 100 times, but never tired of. His eyes twinkled with mischief as he embellished the tales a little more each year. At 80 he was still sharp as a bat and full of life. It was on the third day of the reunion that I first noticed something was off. I was helping in the kitchen when I overheard a heated conversation between my Uncle Dave and Grandpa. They were in Grandpa's study, voices low but intense. Can't keep putting this off, Dad. Uncle Dave was saying the bills are piling up and the business is hanging by a thread. Grandpa's response was firm. I've told you before, David, I'm not selling the lake property. It's been in our family for generations, and it's not going anywhere while I'm still breathing. There was a pause, and then Uncle Dave's voice, cold and hard in a way I'd never heard before. Maybe you won't be breathing for much longer, old man, I gasped, nearly dropping the plate I was drying. Surely I'd misheard. Uncle Dave was Grandpa's youngest son, always the life of the party. He couldn't have said what I thought he said, but as the days went on I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was brewing. Uncle Dave's jovial exterior seemed forced, his laughs a little too loud, his smiles never quite reaching his eyes. I caught him having whispered conversations with my cousin Jake, both of them looking furtive and anxious. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, maybe the stress of having so many people in one place was getting to me. But then came the night that changed everything. I couldn't sleep, the humid summer air making my sheets stick to my skin. I decided to sneak down to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I crept down the stairs I heard hushed voices coming from the living room. Are you sure about this, Dad? It was Jake's voice, trembling slightly. I mean, it's Grandpa we're talking about. Uncle Dave's response chilled me to the bone. We don't have a choice, son. The old man's too stubborn as a mule. Once he's gone, the lake property will be sold, and all our problems will be solved. It'll look like natural causes. No one will ever know. I stood frozen on the stairs, my mind reeling. They were planning to kill Grandpa. My own uncle and cousin were plotting murder. For a moment I considered rushing in confronting them on the spot, but what if they denied it? What if no one believed me? I needed proof. Over the next day, I watched Uncle Dave like a hawk, all while trying to act normal. It was exhausting pretending everything was fine, while knowing what I knew I wanted to warn Grandpa, but I was afraid of tipping off Uncle Dave before I had concrete evidence. That night I positioned myself in the hallway outside Grandpa's room, hidden behind a large potted plant. Hours ticked by and I was starting to think maybe I'd misunderstood, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. Then just after midnight I saw Uncle Dave emerge from his room. He moved silently down the hall, a small vial clutched in his hand. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he'd hear it. As he slipped into Grandpa's room, I crept to the door, peering through the crack, and that's when I saw it, the moonlight glinting off the knife as Uncle Dave unscrewed the cap of the vial. Without thinking I burst into the room. Stop! I shouted, flipping on the light switch. Uncle Dave whirled around, his face a mask of shock and rage. Grandpa stirred in his bed, blinking in confusion at the scene before him. Sarah, Dave, what's going on? Grandpa's voice was thick with sleep. Uncle Dave was trying to poison you, Grandpa, I said, my voice shaking. I heard him planning it with Jake. They want to sell the lake property. For a moment the room was silent, then Uncle Dave lunged at me, the knife flashing in his hand. I screamed and ducked, the blade whistling past my ear. Grandpa, moving with a speed that bellied his 80 years, leapt from the bed and tackled Uncle Dave. They crashed to the floor, the knife skittering away under the dresser. The commotion brought the rest of the family running. Within minutes, the room was chaos. Aunt Ly was sobbing, my cousins were shouting, and Uncle Dave was being restrained by my dad and Uncle Bob as the police sirens wailed in the distance. The full story came out. Uncle Dave's business was failing and he was drowning in debt. He convinced himself that selling the valuable lakefront property was his only way out. When Grandpa refused, desperation had driven him to consider the unthinkable. The next few days were a blur of police statements, family meetings, and tears. Uncle Dave and Jake were arrested, and the family was left to grapple with the betrayal. Grandpa, showing a strength and compassion I could hardly comprehend, insisted on getting Dave the help he needed rather than pressing charges. He's still my son, Grandpa said, his voice heavy with sadness. Somewhere along the way he lost himself. We need to help him find his way back. As for me, I was hailed as a hero, but I didn't feel like one. I felt sad, angry, and more than a little lost. How could I ever trust my own judgment again if I could be so wrong about Uncle Dave? Who else might I be wrong about? Grandpa seemed to sense my turmoil. The night before everyone was set to leave, he called me out to the dock. We sat there, feet dangling in the cool lake water, watching the stars reflect on the surface. You know, Sarah, he said, his voice gentle, what you did took real courage, not just stopping Dave, but being willing to see the truth when it would have been easier to look away. I shook my head. I should have said something sooner, maybe, if I had. No, Grandpa interrupted firmly, you can't think like that. You did the right thing when it mattered most. That's all anyone can ask. We sat in silence for a while, the soft lapping of the water against the dock soothing my frayed nerves. Life's going to throw you curveballs, kiddo, Grandpa continued. People will disappoint you. Situations will arise that you never could have predicted. The trick is to face them head on. With honesty and courage, you've got those qualities. And spades, his words washed over me, not erasing the pain and confusion of the past few days, but softening their edges. I leaned my head on his shoulder, feeling safe for the first time since overhearing that fateful conversation. As we walked back to the cabin, Grandpa chuckled softly. You know, I think this calls for a change in tradition from now on. Let's make our family reunions a little less exciting, shall we? I couldn't help but laugh. The sound startling in the quiet night, agreed Grandpa. Next year let's stick to board games and barbecues. The events of that summer changed our family forever. Uncle Dave got the help he needed, and over time began the long process of rebuilding trust with the family. Jake S.A. young and influenced by his father's desperation was given a second chance. As for me, I learned that family is complicated. Love doesn't always protect us from making terrible mistakes, but it can guide us back to the right path. I learned to trust my instincts, to speak up when something feels wrong, and to face Difficult truths hidden every summer. We still gather at the lake. The reunions are different now. More subdued perhaps, but also more genuine. We've seen the darker side of ourselves and come out the other side stronger and more appreciative of the bonds that tie us together. And every year, as I sit on that old dock with Grandpa watching the stars reflect on the lake, I'm grateful for the family I have, for the lessons I've learned, and for the courage to face whatever curveballs life might throw my way. The world tilted on its axis as I stared at the empty space where my passport should have been. My heart raced, palms sweating as I frantically searched every pocket, every corner of my small hostel room, but deep down I knew the truth. I was stranded in a foreign country, thousands of miles from home, with no way to prove who I was. Little did I know this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would push me to the very edge of my sanity. My name is Alex, and until that moment I had been living my dream of backpacking through Europe. Fresh out of college, I'd saved for years to take this trip, determined to see the world before settling into the grind of adult life. 3 weeks in, I'd made my way from London to Paris, then to Rome, and now I found myself in the heart of Athens. The day had started like any other on my journey. I'd spent the morning exploring the Acropolis, marveling at the ancient ruins and soaking in the rich history of the city. As the afternoon heat became oppressive, I retreated to my hostel for a siesta, planning to head out again in the evening to experience Athens' vibrant nightlife. But when I reached for my money belt to grab some cash, my blood ran cold. The belt was there, but it was empty. My passport, credit cards, and most of my cash all gone. Panic set in as I tried to retrace my steps. Had I been pickpocketed at the crowded tourist site? Had I absent-mindedly left my belt somewhere? The possibilities swirled in my mind, each more alarming than the last. I rushed to the hostel's front desk, hoping against hope that someone had turned in my belongings. The bored-looking clerk merely shrugged, suggesting I try the police station. With no other options, I set out into the unfamiliar streets of Athens, the sun setting and casting long shadows that seemed to mirror my growing sense of dread. The police station was a chaotic mess of people and paperwork. After waiting for what felt like hours, I finally spoke to an officer who took my report with an air of indifference. These things happen, he said, his accent thick. Maybe it will turn up, maybe not. You should contact your embassy. Defeated, I trudged back to the hostel without my passport or money. I couldn't check into a new place or buy a ticket home. I was trapped. That night, as I lay sleepless in my bunk, every creak and rustle in the hostel made me jump. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Who had my identity now? What would they do with it? The next morning I set out for the American embassy, hope mingling with spiration in my chest. But as I navigated the busy streets, an unsettling feeling crept over me. Was it just paranoia, or were people watching me? More than once I caught glimpses of the same face in the crowd, a man with dark eyes and a scar on his left cheek. At the embassy, I was told it would take several days to process an emergency passport. The staff were sympathetic, but firm. There was nothing they could do to speed up the process. They provided me with a small loan to cover basic expenses and advised me to stay put and keep a low profile. As I left the embassy, the feeling of being watched intensified. I quickened my pace, and weaving through the crowded streets made my heart pounding. When I glanced back, I saw him, the man with the scar, no longer trying to hide his pursuit. I broke into a run, adrenal and coursing through my veins. I ducked down alleys and side streets, trying to lose him in the mosaic layout of the old city. Finally gasping for breath, I found myself in a small deserted square. For a moment I thought I'd lost him, then a hand grabbed my arm, spinning me around. It was him, his face twisted in a menacing grin. You've led us on quite a chase, Alex, he said, his English perfect, but accented. But the game is over now. Before I could react, a cloth was pressed over my mouth and nose. The world went black. I awoke in a dimly lit room, my head pounding as my eyes adjusted. I realized I was in some kind of warehouse, surrounded by computer equipment and stacks of papers. The man with the scar stood nearby, watching me intently. Welcome back, he said. I hope you'll forgive the rough treatment, but we couldn't risk you making a scene. Who are you? I managed to croak out. What do you want from me? He chuckled, a sound devoid of any real mirth. Who we are isn't important. As for what we want, well, Alex, you've unwittingly stumbled into Something much bigger than a simple case of lost documents. Over the next hour he explained my stolen identity wasn't random. I had been specifically targeted. My background, young American with no criminal record, made me the perfect candidate for their operation. They were part of an international crime syndicate, specializing in identity theft and fraud on a massive scale. You see, Alex, he said, pacing around me, with your identity we can create a whole new person, someone who can open bank accounts, take out loans, even cross borders, without raising suspicion, and the best part, you'll take the fall for everything. The reality of my situation crashed over me like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about being stranded anymore. My entire future was at stake. Everything I had worked for, every dream I had for my life was about to be destroyed. You can't do this, I pleaded. I'll go to the police, the embassy, I'll tell them everything. The man laughed. And tell them what? That an international crime syndicate kidnapped you and stole your identity. Who would believe such a fantastic story? No, Alex. You're going to do exactly what we say, or things will get very unpleasant for you and for your family back home. The threat to my family was the final straw. Something inside me snapped in. That moment I knew I had to find a way out, no matter the cost. Over the next few days they kept me under constant surveillance. I was forced to make scripted phone calls to the embassy and my family, assuring everyone that I was fine, just extending my trip. All the while I watched helplessly as they used my identity to commit fraud on a massive scale, but I wasn't giving up. I observed their routines, looking for any weakness in their security. I memorized snippets of conversations, piecing together information about their operation, and I waited for my chance. It came on the 5th day. One of my guards got careless, leaving his phone attended for a few crucial minutes. With shaking hands, I managed to send a quick coded message to a friend back home, someone I knew would understand the gravity of the situation and contact the right authorities. The response was swift. Within hours, I heard sirens approaching. The gang panicked, rushing to destroy evidence. In the chaos, I managed to slip away, running blindly through the streets of Athens, until I quite literally ran into a police officer. The next few days were a whirlwind of interrogation statements and diplomatic negotiations. Slowly, the full scope of the operation came to light. My kidnapping had inadvertently exposed a criminal network spanning multiple countries. As I finally boarded a plane home, a temporary passport in hand, I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. The ordeal was over, but its effects would stay with me for a long time. In the months that followed, I worked with authorities to untangle the mess the criminals had made of my identity. It was a long, frustrating process, but gradually I reclaimed my life. The experience changed me profoundly. I became hyper-vigilant about personal security, but I also gained a new appreciation for the fragility of the systems we rely on to define who we are. I still travel, but now I do it with my eyes wide open, always aware that adventure and danger often walk hand in hand. My lost passport led me down a dark path, but it also showed me a strength within myself that I never knew existed. In the end, I emerged not just with my identity intact, but with a deeper understanding of who I truly am. The roar of the truck's engine shattered the desert silence, growing louder as it bore down on us. I gripped the steering wheel of my beat-up sedan, knuckles white, foot pressed to the floor. Faster, Jake shouted from the passenger seat, his voice cracking with panic. They're gaining on us. I didn't need to look in the rearview mirror to know he was right. The vengeful gang we'd unwittingly crossed was closing in, and our lives hung in the balance with every passing second. Just 24 hours earlier, I was living out my dream of a cross-country road trip. My name's Sam, and I'd spent the last 3 weeks meandering from my hometown in New Jersey towards the California coast. The open road, cheap motels, and endless diners. It was everything I'd imagined and more. I was somewhere in the vast expanse of the Nevada desert when I spotted him, a lone figure on the side of the road, thumb outstretched. Now, I'm not usually one to pick up hitchhikers. My mom's voice echoed in my head, warning me about the dangers, but something about this guy made me pause. He looked young, maybe early 20s like me, and the desperation on his face was palpable. I pulled over, rolling down my window. Where you headed? I asked. Anywhere but Here man, he replied, his voice hoarse, please, I just need to get as far away as possible against my better judgment. I unlocked the passenger door hop and he scrambled into the car, tossing a small backpack at his feet. Up close I could see he was about my age, with wild unkempt hair and a few days worth of stubble on his chin. His clothes were dirty and torn like he'd been running through the desert for days. Thanks, he muttered, sinking into the seat. I'm Jake. Sam, I replied, pulling back onto the empty highway. You okay? You look like you've been through hell. Jake let out a bitter laugh. You have no idea, man, no idea. We drove in silence for a while. The only sound, the hum of the engine and the occasional static from the radio as it struggled to find a signal out here in the middle of nowhere. I could feel the tension radiating off Jake in waves. Every few minutes he'd twist in his seat to look out the rear window as if expecting to see someone following us. Finally curiosity got the better of me. You running from something, Jake? He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, not something, someone, a whole lot of someone's. Actually my grip tightened on the steering wheel. What do you mean? Jake took a deep breath. I got mixed up with some bad people, a gang. They promised me easy money, you know, but it wasn't easy. And it wasn't just money they were after. A chill ran down my spine. What had I gotten myself into? They made me do things, Jake continued, his voice cracking. Terrible things I couldn't take it anymore, so I ran. But they don't let people just walk away. They're after me now, and if they catch me, he trailed off. Yo, but I could fill in the blanks. I swallowed hard, suddenly very aware of how alone we were out here in the desert. How far behind you are they? Jake shook his head. I don't know, but they won't stop until they find me. I'm sorry, man, I shouldn't have gotten you involved in this. If you want to drop me off at the next town. No, I interrupted, surprising myself. No, I am not going to abandon you out here. We'll figure something out. Relief flooded Jake's face. Thank you. You have no idea what this means to me. As night fell, the desert transformed. The vast emptiness that had seemed almost peaceful in the daylight now felt oppressive, hiding untold dangers in its shadows. We drove on the headlights, cutting a narrow path through the darkness. It was around midnight when I first noticed the lights in my rear view mirror, distant at first, but steadily growing closer. Jake, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, don't look now, but I think we've got company. He twisted in his seat, peering out the back window. He hissed, it's them. How did they find us so fast? My mind raced. We were still miles from the nearest town. There was nowhere to hide out here, nowhere to run. Hold on, I growled, pressing down on the accelerator. The old sedan groaned in protest, but picked up speed. The lights behind us grew brighter. I could make out the outline of a large truck now gaining on us. Faster, Jake urged, panic evident in his voice. Please, you have to go faster. I was already pushing the car to its limits. The engine whined, and I could smell something burning. We weren't going to be able to outrun them. Suddenly, I spotted a narrow dirt road branching off from the highway. Without thinking, I yanked the wheel hard to the right. We fishtailed as we hit the unpaved surface, kicking up a cloud of dust behind us. The truck overshot the turn, buying us a few precious seconds. I killed the headlights, plunging us into near total darkness as I navigated the twisting path by moonlight alone. Where does this road go? Jake asked, clinging to his seat as we bounced over the rough terrain. No idea, I admitted. But it's our only shot. We drove for what felt like hours, every bump and jolt sending a spike of fear through me. Had we lost them, or were they still out there searching just as I was starting to think we might have escaped? I saw at a flash of light in the distance they had found the road. I muttered, but Jake, we need to ditch the car. It's too easy to spot out here. He nodded grimly. I pulled off to the side of the road, cutting the engine. We grabbed what supplies we could, some water bottles, a flashlight, and Jake's backpack, and set off into the desert on foot. The night was eerily quiet, our labored breathing and the crunch of our footsteps on the sandy ground seeming impossibly loud. Every few minutes we'd pause to listen for any sign of pursuit. We had been walking for about an hour when we heard it. The distant rumble of engines. This way, Jake hissed, grabbing my arm and pulling me towards a cluster of large boulders. We scrambled behind them, pressing ourselves against the cool stone. The sound grew louder. Headlights swept across the desert, illuminating our hiding spot. For a heart-stopping moment, before moving on, we held our breath as a convoy of vehicles passed by on the road we had abandoned once the sounds had faded into the distance. When we allowed ourselves to breathe again, "That was close," I whispered. Jake nodded, his face pale in the moonlight. "Too close, we need to keep moving. There's an old mining town about 10 miles from here. If we can make it there, we might be able to find help." And so we walked. The desert night was cold and I found myself shivering despite the exertion. Jake kept up a steady stream of chatter, telling me about the gang, how he had gotten involved, and all the things he wished he had done differently. I think he was talking more to keep himself calm than for my benefit, but I listened anyway, offering the occasional word of encouragement as the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. We crested a hill and saw it a collection of dilapidated buildings, in the distance the abandoned mining town. We made it. Jake breathed a note of hope in his voice for the first time since picked him up. But our relief was short-lived. As we approached the town, we heard the unmistakable sound of engines. "No," Jake moaned. "How did they find us?" We ducked behind an old water tower, watching in horror as 3 trucks rolled into the center of town. Men with guns jumped out, spreading out to search the buildings. "What do we do now?" I asked, fear clawing at my throat. Jake was quiet for a moment, his face a mask of guilt and resolve. "You've done more than enough for me already. I can't ask you to risk your life any further. There's a ravine just past the edge of town. If you can make it there, you should be able to follow it to safety." I shook my head. "I'm not leaving you here to face them alone. You have to," he insisted. "This is my mess. I need to face it, but you can still get out of this. Please, Sam, go, and thank you for everything." Before I could protest further, Jake stood up and walked out from behind the water tower, hands raised. "I'm here," he shouted. "It's me. You won't leave the town alone." I watched helpless as the men surrounded Jake. There was a brief scuffle, and then they were loading him into one of the trucks. As the convoy started to pull away, I made a decision. I couldn't just leave Jake to whatever fate awaited him. Staying low, I crept towards the last truck in line. Just as it was about to move, I managed to grab onto the back, hauling myself into the truck bed. As we drove off into the rising sun, I knew the danger wasn't over. It was just beginning, but I also knew that whatever happened next, I wasn't going to abandon the desperate hitchhiker who had turned my simple road trip into the most harrowing adventure of my life. The desert stretched out behind us, silent and indifferent to the drama that had played out under its starry skies, and ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the faint glimmer of hope that somehow, against all odds, we might just make it out of this alive. The crunch of gravel under heavy boots jolted me awake. My eyes snapped open, heart racing as I peered through the van's curtains. A hulking figure loomed just outside, his breath fogging the window in the crisp mountain air. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't notice the slight tremor of the curtain as I watched him. This wasn't how my peaceful getaway was supposed to go. In that moment, I realized my dream of solitude had become a nightmare of isolation. My name is Olivia, and just yesterday, I was congratulating myself on finding the perfect spot for a weekend of stealth camping as a freelance writer, constantly tethered to my laptop and phone. I'd been craving an escape from the digital world. The idea of parking my converted van in some remote location surrounded by nothing but nature seemed like paradise. I'd spent weeks researching, poring over maps and online forums to find the ideal location. Finally, I settled on a spot deep in the Cascade Mountains. It was off the main roads, accessible only by a winding dirt track that my van barely managed to navigate. But when I finally broke through the trees into a small clearing overlooking a pristine mountain lake, I knew the difficult journey had been worth it. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. I hiked around the lake, took in the breathtaking views, and enjoyed the profound silence that's only possible when you're miles from civilization. As the sun set, I settled into my van with a good book, feeling more relaxed than I had in years. It was the sound of an engine that first alerted me that something was wrong. In a place this remote, there shouldn't have been anyone else around. I peered out the window and saw headlights cutting through the darkness, growing closer. A battered pickup truck pulled into the clearing, its engine cutting off abruptly. 2 men got out, their faces hidden in the shadows. They moved with purpose, checking the perimeter of the Clearing before approaching my van. Panic surged through me. I was alone, miles from help. With no cell signal to call for assistance, I debated starting the van and trying to make a run for it, but the narrow, treacherous road meant I'd never outpace their truck, so I did the only thing I could think of. I slipped into the small storage space under my bed, pulling the false floor closed above me. It was tight and uncomfortable, but it was my only option from my hiding spot. I could hear them moving around outside. Their voices were low, but I caught snippets of conversation that made my blood run cold. Perfect spot for the drop. No one comes out here. Need to secure the area. I realized with growing horror that I had inadvertently stumbled into the middle of some kind of illegal operation. Drug deal, weapons exchange. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Hours passed. I lay there in the darkness, barely daring to breathe, my muscles cramped from holding still for so long, but fear kept me frozen in place. Just before dawn, I heard more vehicles arrive. There was a flurry of activity outside, boxes being moved, hushed conversations, the clink of metal. Then, as suddenly as if had begun, it was over. Engines roared to life, and the sounds of vehicles faded into the distance. I waited, counting my heartbeats, straining to hear any sign that someone might have stayed behind. After what felt like an eternity, I finally gathered the courage to emerge from my hiding place. The clearing looked undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. If it weren't for the multiple sets of tire tracks in the mud, I might have convinced myself it had all been a terrible dream. I knew I needed to get out of there fast, but as I turned the key in the ignition, my heart sank. The engine sputtered and died. I tried again and again, but it was no use. Whether from the rough journey in or simple bad luck, my van had chosen this moment to break down. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I was stranded in a remote location, my only shelter compromised, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the criminals returned to their drop site. I forced myself to think rationally. I had supplies, food, water, and warm clothes. I had a general idea of which direction would lead me back to civilization. My best bet was to grab what I could carry and start hiking out. I had just finished packing a backpack with essentials when I heard the distant rumble of an engine. They were coming back. With no time to spare, I shouldered my pack and plunged into the forest. The underbrush was thick, branches whipping at my face as I pushed through. I had no trail to follow, just a vague sense of direction and the desperate need to put distance between myself and the clearing. I walked for hours, the forest growing denser and more disorienting with each step. The mountain terrain was unforgiving, every hill feeling like a mountain itself. As the day wore on, exhaustion began to set in. The fear that had been driving me forward started to give way to a bone-deep weariness. Just as I was considering stopping to rest, I heard voices in the distance. My heart leapt. Had I somehow stumbled upon other hikers? But as the voices grew closer, I recognized the gruff tones from the night before. They were searching for me. I pushed on, ignoring the burning in my legs and the stitch in my side. The voices behind me grew louder, more urgent. They knew I was here, and they were closing in. As I crested a small rise, my foot caught on a root. I tumbled forward, rolling down the other side of the hill. Pain shot through my ankle as I came to a stop, and I bit back a cry. Dazed and injured, I looked up to find myself at the mouth of a small cave. Without thinking, I crawled inside, pressing myself as far back into the darkness as I could. I heard them reach the top of the hill. Their voices is clear now. She can't have gone far. Find her. Flashlight beam swept the area, drawing closer to my hiding spot. I held my breath, pressing myself against the cold stone, praying they wouldn't think to check the cave. A beam of light swept across the cave entrance. I closed my eyes, certain this was the end, but then I heard one of them call out, "Nothing here, let's check further down the ridge." Their voices faded as they moved away. I'd stay frozen in place, afraid to even breathe too loudly as the minutes ticked by and the forest fell silent. I finally allowed myself to relax slightly, but I knew I couldn't stay here. Night was falling, and with it the temperature was dropping rapidly. I was injured, lost, and still in danger. I needed to find help, and soon, gritting my teeth against the pain in my ankle, I crawled out of the cave. The forest was eerily quiet now, the fading light casting long shadows between the trees. I picked a direction and started limping, using a sturdy branch as a makeshift crutch. I walked through the night, fear and determination pushing me forward even as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I heard the most beautiful sound imaginable: cars on a highway stumbling out of the tree line. I found myself on the side of a busy mountain road. I must have looked AF bright, dirty, bleeding, and wild-eyed, but to me those passing cars represented safety and salvation. I flagged down the first vehicle I saw, an old station wagon, driven by a kindly-looking older couple. They took one look at me, and immediately pulled over. "Oh, you poor dear," the woman exclaimed. "What happened to you?" Through tears of relief, I managed to explain that I'd gotten lost while hiking and needed to get to the nearest town. They didn't hesitate to help, wrapping me in a blanket and driving me to the local ranger station. The following days were a blur of police statements, medical checkups, and calls to worried family members. The authorities took my story seriously, especially when they found evidence of the drop site at the clearing where I'd parked my van. As for me, once the immediate danger had passed, I was left to grapple with the psychological impact of what I'd been through. My dream of finding solitude in nature had turned into a nightmare, leaving me jumpy and paranoid. But as time passed, I began to process the experience. I realized that while the wilderness had put me in danger, it had also provided me with the means to escape and survive. My ordeal had shown me a strength I didn't know I possessed. I still love nature, still feel the call of quiet places away from the bustle of everyday life, but now I have approached these adventures with a newfound respect for the power and unpredictability of the wild. I'm more prepared, more cautious, but also more confident in my ability to handle whatever challenges come my way. My ill-fated camping trip taught me that true solitude comes with risks, but it also offers profound rewards. The peace I was seeking can't be found by simply running away from the world it comes from. Facing our fears, overcoming challenges, and finding the quiet strength that resides within each of us. Now, when I look at the mountains on the horizon, I feel a complex mix of emotions: respect, apprehension, and an enduring sense of wonder. The wilderness tested me, nearly broke me, but ultimately made me stronger, and for that, despite everything, I'm grateful. The muzzle of the rifle pressed against my back, cold and unyielding move. A gruff voice commanded, pushing me forward through the dense underbrush. My mind raced desperately, trying to understand how my peaceful hiking trip had turned into this nightmare. Just hours ago I had been reveling in the solitude of the wilderness. Now I was a prisoner, being marched deeper into the forest by men who looked like they'd stepped out of a paramilitary catalog. And I had no idea why. My name is Chris, and I've always been an avid hiker. There's something about losing yourself in nature that cleanses the soul. That's why I decided to take a week off work and head to the Appalachian Trail. I'd hiked sections of it before, but this time I wanted to explore some of the less traveled areas, really get away from it all. The first few days were exactly what I needed. The weather was perfect, cool and crisp with that hint of autumn in the air. I'd wake up with the sun, break camp, and spend my days trekking through forests that seemed to go on forever. At night I'd fall asleep to the sound of distant owls and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was on the fourth day that things went sideways. I had veered off the main trail, following a less defined path that promised some spectacular views. According to my guidebook, the going was tougher, but the solitude was worth it. I hadn't seen another soul all day. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something that made me stop short. In a small clearing ahead, partially hidden by the trees, was what looked like some kind of compound. There were several small buildings, camouflaged to blend in with the surroundings, and a larger structure that resembled a warehouse. My curiosity piqued. I moved closer, trying to get a better look. That's when I heard the first shout, "Hey you there, stop!" I turned to see two men emerging from the trees behind me. They were dressed in full tactical gear, complete with face masks and assault rifles. My heart leapt into my throat. This was no ordinary campsite. "I'm sorry," I stammered, raising my hands. "I didn't mean to trespass. I'm just a hiker. I'll turn around." And shut up, one of the men barked, leveling his rifle at me. "You're coming with us." And just like that, I was their prisoner. They marched me into the compound past other armed men who eyed me suspiciously. I was Taken to one of the smaller buildings and shoved inside. It was sparse, just a chair, a table, and a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Sit, my captor ordered, and don't move. For what felt like hours I sat there, my mind whirling with possibilities. What was this place? A militia compound, some kind of cult? Whatever it was, I knew I was in serious trouble. Finally the door opened and a new man entered. Unlike the others, he wasn't masked, he was older, with graying hair and hard eyes that seemed to look right through me. Who are you? He demanded. Without preamble, my name's Chris, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm just a hiker. I swear I didn't mean to stumble onto you. Whatever this is, if you let me go, I promise I won't say anything to anyone. The man studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. I'm afraid it's not that simple, Chris. You've seen things you shouldn't have seen. We can't just let you walk away. My blood ran cold. What are you going to do with me? He didn't answer directly. Instead, he pulled up a chair across from me. Tell me, Chris, what do you know about government overreach, about the erosion of our freedoms? And so began one of the most surreal conversations of my life. For the next hour, this man, who introduced himself simply as the commander, laid out a conspiracy theory, so wild it would have been laughable if I wasn't being held at gunpoint. He spoke of shadow governments, of impending societal collapse, of the need to take action to preserve their way of life. I nodded along, too terrified to do anything else. As he talked, I began to understand the gravity of my situation. These weren't just some weekend warriors playing soldier in the woods. These were dangerous men with a warped worldview and the firepower to back it up. When he finished his diet, the commander leaned back, fixing me with that penetrating stare again. So Chris, what do you think? Are you ready to open your eyes to the truth? I swallowed hard, knowing my answer could mean the difference between life and death. I never thought about it like that before. I said carefully, you've given me a lot to think about. A smile spread across his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. Good, that's good, Chris, because you have a choice to make. You can join us, become part of something greater than yourself, or he let the alternative hang in the air. Unspoken, but crystal clear. I want to join, I said quickly, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. I want to learn more. The commander nodded, seemingly satisfied. Excellent, we'll start your orientation immediately. What followed was a crash course in paranoia and extremism. I was given literature to read, shown propaganda videos, and made to participate in training exercises that were nothing short of military drills. All the while I was watched closely, never left alone for more than a few minutes at a time. Days blurred together, I lost track of time. Unsure how long I'd been in the compound, but I never lost sight of my goal, to find a way out. I played along, pretending to buy into their ideology, all while looking for any opportunity to escape. It came on what I think was my 5th day there. There was a commotion in the compound. Apparently one of their patrols had spotted another hiker near the perimeter. As the men mobilized to intercept this potential threat, I saw my chance in the chaos. I managed to slip away from my assigned mentor for the day. I ran for the tree line, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they'd hear it behind me. I could hear shouts as they realized I was missing. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or dire tie-in. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and the compound. Gunshots rang out, bullets whizzing past me in splintering tree bark. I don't know how long I ran, hours. Maybe. The forest seemed endless, every tree looking the same as the last, but I didn't dare stop even when my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. The fear of being caught pushed me onward. As night fell, the temperature dropped dramatically. I was ill-equipped for the sea cold, having left all my gear back at the compound, but stopping wasn't an option. I pressed on through the darkness, using the stars to try and maintain a consistent direction. It was nearing dawn when I finally heard, at the distant sound of traffic. I could have cried with relief. Summoning the last of my strength, I pushed towards the noise. I burst out of the tree line onto the shoulder of a highway, startling a trucker who had pulled over to check his map. He took one look at my wildy, disheveled appearance and reached for his phone. Don't call the police, I gasped, afraid the local authorities might be in league with the militia. Please, I need to get to the state police. It's an emergency. To his credit, the trucker didn't ask questions. He drove me to the nearest state police barracks, where I spilled the whole incredible story. They were skeptical at first, but as I provided details about the compound's location and operations, they realized the gravity of the situation. What followed was a whirlwind of federal agents, debriefings, and protective custody. The compound was raided, its members arrested. The scope of their planned activities chilled me to the bone. I had stumbled upon a domestic terrorist cell in its infancy. In the months that followed as I testified and tried to piece my life back together, I grappled with the psychological impact of what I'd been through. The wilderness, once my sanctuary, now felt tainted. Every snapping twig, every shadowy figure on the street sent my heart racing, but slowly, with time and therapy, I began to heal. I realized that what happened to me was an anomaly, the actions of troubled men who had twisted their fear into something dangerous. The forest itself wasn't to blame these days. I still hike, but I do it differently now. I'm more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I always let someone know where I'm going and when I'll be back, and I carry a satellite phone just in case. My experience taught me that while there's beauty in solitude, there's also vulnerability. It showed me the darkness that can lurk in the hearts of men, but also the resilience of the human spirit. Most importantly, it reminded me to never take my freedom for granted. Now, when I stand at a trailhead looking out at the wilderness before me, I feel a complex mix of emotions: respect, apprehension, and an enduring sense of wonder. The forest tested me, nearly broke me, but ultimately it led me back to myself, and for that, despite everything, I'm grateful. The locks clicked, came into place with a chilling finality. I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, watching as my host family's warm smiles morphed into cold, calculating stares. In that moment, I realized the quaint farmhouse I'd been so excited to stay in was nothing more than an elaborate trap, and I had walked right into it. My name is Emma, and until that moment, I thought I was living out my dream of immersing myself in a new culture. I'd always been fascinated by different ways of life, so when I stumbled upon a website offering homestays with traditional families in rural Eastern Europe, I jumped at the chance. The Petrovs seemed perfect, a Kindle-looking couple in their 50s with grown children, and a picturesque farm in the countryside. They promised an authentic experience, far from the tourist traps. The journey to their remote village was long and winding as my taxi bumped along increasingly narrow roads. The landscape transformed from bustling towns to rolling fields dotted with the occasional cluster of houses. By the time we pulled up to the Petros farmhouse, I felt like I'd stepped back in time. Mara and Stefan Petrov greeted me warmly, ushering me into their home with enthusiastic gestures and broken English. The house was exactly as I'd imagined, all weathered wood and handmade textiles, with the comforting smell of home-cooked food wafting from the kitchen. That first evening was lovely. We shared a hearty meal, communicating through a mixture of simple English, exaggerated hand gestures, and my rudimentary phrase book. Romanian. Mara showed me to a cozy guest room, patting my hand and calling me Draga dear. I fell asleep feeling excited about the weeks ahead. The next few days passed in a blur of new experiences. I helped milk the goats, learned to make cheese, and even tried my hand at weaving on Mara's ancient loom. Stefan took me on long walks, pointing out local plants and wildlife. In the evenings, neighbors would drop by, filling the house with lively chatter I couldn't understand, but enjoyed nonetheless. It was on the 5th day that I first noticed something odd. I'd been trying to send emails to my family, but the Wi-Fi, which had been spotty to begin with, seemed to have stopped working entirely. When I asked Mara about it, a flash of something crossed her face before she smiled apologetically and said the internet was often unreliable in their village. That night I overheard Stefan on the phone speaking rapidly in Romanian. I only caught a few words, but one of them was definitely American. When he saw me, he abruptly ended the call. His usual friendly demeanor, replaced by a guarded look. Unease began to creep, and I told myself I was being paranoid, that the language barrier was making me misinterpret things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next morning, I decided to walk into the village to find a phone to call home, but as I headed for the door, Mara intercepted me, insisting I help her in the garden. When I tried to explain my plans, her grip on my arm tightened, her smile becoming fixed and Unnatural, no, she said, her voice tight. Not safe for you in village alone, stay here, safe here. That's when I knew this wasn't just cultural differences or misunderstandings, something was very, very wrong. I retreated to my room, mind racing. I needed to leave, but how? I was miles from anywhere in a country where I didn't speak the language. I didn't even know exactly where I was. The Petrov had arranged all the transportation as panic began to set in. I forced myself to think rationally. First things first, I needed to get a message out. My phone still had no signal, but maybe I could find a way to connect to the Wi-Fi. Even for just a moment I crept downstairs, listening for any sign of Mara or Stefan. The house was quiet. In the living room I spotted Stefan's laptop on a side table, heart pounding. I opened it. To my relief, it wasn't password protected, but as I tried to connect to the internet, I realized with a sinking feeling that it was password. Frantically, I tried common passwords, their names, birthdays I'd seen on photos around the house. Nothing worked. In desperation, I typed in American, the word I'd heard Stefan say on the phone. The Wi-Fi connected. With shaking hands, I opened the browser and quickly typed out an email to my sister. Help, trapped in Romania. Petrov's not who they seem. Call police. I hit send. Just as I heard footsteps on the stairs, I managed to close the laptop and scramble away before Stefan entered the room, but one look at his face told me he knew something was wrong. His eyes darted from me to the laptop and back end. That's when the facade dropped completely. Stefan bellowed for Mara, who came running in. Rapid Romanian, he gestured wildly at me, and the laptop. Mara's face hardened as she turned to me. What did you do? She demanded, all pretense of broken English gone. I just wanted to check my email, I stammered, backing away. Stefan advanced on me, his face twisted with rage. You stupid girl, he snarled. Do you have any idea what you've done? I turned to run, but Mara was faster. She grabbed me, her grip surprisingly strong for such a small woman. Stefan moved swiftly through the house, locking doors and pulling curtains closed. And that's how I found myself standing in the middle of their living room, the sound of locks clicking shut echoing in my ears. Sit, Stefan commanded, pointing to a chair. When I hesitated, he grabbed my arm, shoving me down roughly. We took you in, Mara said, her voice cold. Gave you food, shelter, and this is how you repay us, by snooping. Please, I begged, tears welling in my eyes. I don't understand what's going on. Why are you doing this? Stefan laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. You Americans, always so naive. Did you really think we invited you here out of the goodness of our hearts? Do you know how much an American kidney sells for on the black market? The blood drained from my face as the full horror of my situation sank in. This wasn't just a scam or a kidnapping. These people were organ traffickers and lying, and I was their next payday. No one knows you're here, Mara said, almost soothingly. No one will come looking if you cooperate. This can be painless fight, and she trailed off, the threat clear in her eyes. My mind raced. The email had it sent. Would my sister understand? Even if she did, would help come in time? Hours passed. I was kept under constant watch, not allowed to move from the chair except to use the bathroom, and even then Mara stood guard outside the door. As night fell, my terror grew. What if they decided to move me, or worse, to go ahead with their plan? Email, be damned. Just when I thought I couldn't take the tension anymore, a sound broke the silence. Car engines, growing louder. Headlights swept across the windows. Stefan cursed ing out through the curtains. Police, he spat. The next few minutes were chaos. Stefan and Mara argued furiously in Romanian. I heard the word American again, along with what sounded like embassy. Suddenly Stefan grabbed me, pulling me to my feet. You say nothing, he hissed, pressing a knife to my side. You tell them you're here willingly, or I swear I'll kill you before they can save you. There was a pounding at the door. Police, open up. Stefan plastered on a smile, the same one that had welcomed me days ago. He opened the door, keeping me closed, the knife hidden, but its pressure a constant reminder against my ribs. But the police weren't fooled. Maybe it was the terror in my eyes, or maybe my email had gotten through. After all, within moments, the house was swarming with officers. Stefan and Mara were in handcuffs, and I was being ushered to safety. The next few days passed in a blur of police statements, embassy visits, and tearful phone calls with my family. I learned that the Patters were part of a larger trafficking ring that had been operating for years, luring in tourists and selling their organs on the black market. As I finally boarded a plane home, I felt a complex mix of emotions: relief, trauma, and a lingering sense of disbelief. How could I have been so naive, so trusting? But as the plane took off, carrying me away from my nightmare, I made a decision. I wouldn't let this experience break me. I would learn from it, grow stronger, and use my story to help others. Now when I think back to those days in that farmhouse, I feel a chill run down my spine, but I also feel grateful for my sister who understood my cryptic email, for the police who acted quickly, for my own resilience in the face of unimaginable terror. I still love to travel, still believe in the goodness of most people, but I do it with open eyes now, aware that sometimes the warmest smile can hide the coldest heart. My experience taught me the importance of trusting my instincts, of always having a safety net, and of never taking my freedom for granted. In the end, what happened in that Romanian farmhouse didn't destroy my love for exploring new cultures. It just taught me to do it more wisely, more safely, and for that hard-won wisdom. Despite everything, I'm grateful. The first rock smashed through the window, sending shards of glass flying across the abandoned storefront I'd taken shelter in. Angry shouts echoed from the street outside, growing louder by the second. My heart pounded as I realized the mob had found me. What had started as a simple photography expedition into a ghost town had turned into a fight for survival against a group of squatters who didn't take kindly to outsiders. My name is Alex, and I've always been drawn to the eerie beauty of abandoned places. There's something hauntingly captivating about seeing nature reclaim what humans have left behind. As a freelance photographer, I've made a name for myself, capturing images of forgotten towns, derelict factories, and crumbling mansions, but nothing in my experience had prepared me for what I encountered in the small town of Millbrook. Millbrook wasn't your typical ghost town, unlike the Old West boom towns that dried up when the gold ran out, or the Rust Belt cities hollowed out by economic decline. Millbrook had a more recent and mysterious history. Just 10 years ago, it had been a thriving small town of about 5,000 people. Then almost overnight, it was abandoned. Official reports cited environmental concerns, something about contaminated groundwater, but rumors swirled of government cover-ups and mass evacuations. Whatever the truth, Millbrook had become an urban explorer's dream, and I was determined to be the first to truly document its decay. I arrived just before dawn, parking my car on the outskirts of town and proceeding on foot. The morning mist clung to the empty streets, lending an otherworldly atmosphere to the scene. Abandoned cars lined the road, some with doors still open, as if their owners had fled in a hurry. Nature was already asserting its dominance. Vines crept up buildings and saplings pushed through cracks in the sidewalk as I made my way deeper into town. My camera clicked constantly. Every corner revealed a new tableau of abandonment. A child's bicycle left to rust in a front yard, a movie theater marquee advertising films a decade out of date, a school with homework still scrawled on the blackboards. It was in the town square that I first noticed something was off. The grass here was shorter, as if it had been recently trodden. There were fewer weeds pushing through the pavement, and was that smoke a thin tendril rose from one of the buildings on the far side of the square. Curiosity overcame caution, and I moved closer to investigate. That's when I saw them. People, real living people, emerging from the buildings around the square. They looked rough, unkempt, with a wild gleam in their eyes that made my skin crawl. I realized my mistake too late. These weren't day trippers or fellow urban explorers. These were squatters, people who had made this abandoned town their home, and judging by their reactions, they weren't happy to see me. Hey, a gruff voice shouted, "What do you think you're doing here?" I turned to see a large man with a matted beard advancing on me. Others were emerging from doorways and alleyways, forming a loose circle around me. "I'm sorry," I stammered, raising my hands in what I hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "I'm just a photographer. I didn't realize anyone was living here." "Didn't realize?" the bearded man sneered. "Or didn't care? Come to gawk at us, have you? Take pictures of the freaks who live in the dead town." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the growing crowd. I saw anger in their eyes, but also fear. These people had chosen isolation for a reason, and I was Threat to that. No, it's not like that. I protested. I'll delete the photos. I'll leave right now. You'll never see me again. For a moment I thought it might work. The bearded man, clearly the leader, seemed to be considering my words, but then another voice piped up from the crowd. He's got a camera. He could be with the government. And just like that the mood shifted. The crowd pressed closer, their expressions darkening. Wait, please, I begged, but my words were drowned out by angry shouts. I get him, don't let him leave, destroy the camera. I did the only thing I could. I ran sprinting down the nearest side street. I could hear the mob giving chase behind me. My heavy camera bag slapped against my back as I ran, but I didn't dare discard it. Those photos were my livelihood. I ducked into an alley hoping to lose them in the maze of back streets, but Millbrook's residents knew their town far better than I did. Every turn I took seemed to lead to another group of angry squatters, finally desperate for a hiding place. I spotted a boarded up storefront with one loose plank. I managed to pry it open just enough to squeeze inside, pulling the board back into place behind me. The interior was dark and musty. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out overturned shelves and scattered debris. It looked like an old hardware store. I crouched behind the checkout counter, trying to quiet my ragged breathing as I heard the mob searching outside. For a while it seemed like my hiding place might work. The sounds of the search grew more distant. I began to think about how I could slip out of town unnoticed, but then came the shattering of glass while and I knew my reprieve was over as more rocks smashed through the windows. I looked around frantically for a way out. There, a door behind the counter, probably leading to a stock room. I lunged for it, yanking it open just as the first of the mob began climbing through the broken windows. The stock room was a dead end, but a rusted ladder led up to a hatch in the ceiling with no other option. I began to climb. The hatch was stuck, and for one terrifying moment I thought I was trapped, but with a final desperate shove it gave way and I emerged onto the roof. The town stretched out before me, a patchwork of decay and hidden life. In the distance I could see my car parked at the edge of town. If I could just reach it, but the mob had spotted me. They poured out of the store below, pointing and shouting. Some began to climb fire escapes on neighboring buildings. What followed was a desperate race across the rooftops of Millbrook. I leapt gaps between buildings, scrambled up and down pitched roofs, and navigated treacherous areas where rot had weakened the structures. All the while the mob pursued, their angry cries spurring me on. As I neared the edge of town I realized I had a problem. The buildings here were shorter and there was a considerable drop to the street below, but with the mob closing in behind me I had no choice. I took a deep breath, backed up a few steps, and took a running leap off the roof. I hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact. Pain shot through my ankle, but adrenaline kept me moving. I limped as fast as I could toward my car, fumbling for my keys. The mob had been slowed by having to descend from the roofs, but they were still coming. I could hear them getting closer. As I finally reached my car, my hand shook as I tried to fit the key into the lock. Just as I heard footsteps approaching, the door opened. I dove inside, slamming the lock down and starting the engine in one frantic motion. Rocks pelted the car as I peeled away, tires squealing on the cracked asphalt. I didn't slow down until Millbrook was far behind me, nothing more than a smudge in my rear-view mirror. Only then did the full weight of what had happened hit me. I pulled over, my whole body shaking with delayed shock and adrenaline crash as my breathing slowly returned to normal. I realized I had a decision to make. I had the story of a lifetime, not just photos of an abandoned town, but evidence of a hidden community living off the grid. It could make my career, but I also understood, in a way I hadn't before, why those people were so desperate to keep their existence a secret. They had found refuge in Millbrook, created a life away from a world that had perhaps hurt or rejected them. Did I have the right to expose that? In the end I chose not to publish the photos or tell the full story. I submitted a handful of generic abandoned town shots to my usual clients and locked the rest away. Some stories, I realized, are better left untold. My experience in Millbrook changed me. I still explore abandoned places, still find beauty in decay, but now I do it with a deeper respect for the secrets these forgotten places might hold. I'm more cautious, more aware that even the most deserted Looking town might have eyes watching from the shadows, and sometimes when I'm processing photos of empty streets and crumbling buildings, I think I catch glimpses of movement in the background, a face in a window, a figure ducking out of sight. It's probably just my imagination, but then again maybe not. After all, Millbrook taught me that in this world, you never know who or what might be hiding just out of sight. The room spun as I struggled to keep my eyes open, the sweet-smelling tea still on my lips. Through the haze days, I saw the other retreat participants collapsing around me, their eyes glazed and unseeing. Our charismatic leader Sarah stood in the center, her serene smile now twisted into something sinister as darkness crept in at the edges of my vision. One thought echoed in my mind: I should have trusted my instincts and never come to this spiritual awakening in the remote Oregon forest. My name is Jade, and until that moment I thought I was on a journey of self-discovery and inner peace. Like many people in their late 20s, I had been feeling lost, unsure of my path in life, when a colleague raved about a transformative retreat she'd attended. I was intrigued. The Enlightened Path program promised a week of meditation, nature connection, and guidance from a renowned spiritual teacher. I should have been more skeptical, but the website looked professional and the testimonials were glowing, plus the idea of spending a week in the beautiful Pacific Northwest forests away from the pressures of my job and the constant buzz of city life was incredibly appealing. The retreat center was about 2 hours from Portland, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. As our group of about 20 participants arrived, we were greeted by Sarah, the retreat leader. She was everything I imagined a spiritual guru would be: serene, soft-spoken, with an aura of wisdom that seemed to radiate from her. The first few days were wonderful. We started each morning with yoga and meditation, followed by workshops on mindfulness and self-reflection. In the afternoons we took nature walks, learning about the local flora and fauna. Evenings were spent around a campfire, sharing our experiences and insights. I felt myself beginning to unwind, to shed the layers of stress and doubt I'd been carrying. The other participants seemed to be having similar experiences. There was a sense of camaraderie, of shared purpose. But as the week progressed, I started to notice subtle changes. Sarah's teachings began to take on a more esoteric tone. She spoke of cosmic energies, of transcending the physical plane, of a great awakening that was coming. Some of the other participants were enthralled, hanging on her every word, but something about that made me uneasy. I also couldn't help but notice the way some of the staff members watched us. Their gazes were a little too intent, their smiles a little too fixed. Once I caught one of them quickly hiding a notebook when I walked into the dining hall unexpectedly. On the fourth night, things took a decidedly strange turn. After dinner, Sarah announced that we would be participating in a special ceremony to align our energies with the universe. She produced a large crystal bowl filled with a steaming, sweet-smelling liquid. This sacred tea, she explained, has been used by shamans for centuries to open the mind to higher realms of consciousness. Who among you is ready to take the next step on your spiritual journey? To my astonishment, most of the group eagerly lined up to receive a cup of the mysterious brew. I hung back, a knot of unease forming in my stomach. Sarah's eyes found mine in the crowd. Jade, she said, her voice gentle but insistent, don't you want to join us in this transformative experience? I mumbled an excuse about not feeling well and slipped out of the main hall. Back in my cabin, I paced nervously, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was I overreacting? Maybe this was a normal part of these kinds of retreats, but something felt very, very wrong. Unable to shake my anxiety, I decided to do some investigating. I snuck out of my cabin and made my way to the staff quarters. Most of the buildings were dark, but a light shone from Sarah's office window. Creeping closer, I peered inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. Sarah was there along with two of the staff members. They were poring over files with our names on them. I could see photos, what looked like medical records, and financial information spread out on the desk. I must have made a sound, because suddenly Sarah looked up, her eyes meeting mine through the window. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then she smiled, a cold, calculating expression that sent chills down my spine. I ran back to my cabin, heart pounding. Mind racing, what had I gotten myself into? This wasn't a spiritual retreat, it was something much darker, but what a cult, some kind of scam I didn't know, but I knew I had to get out of. There I started throwing my belongings into my backpack, planning to slip away in the night. But before I could finish, there was a knock at the door. It was Lisa, one of the other participants. Her eyes were wide, her pupils dilated. Jade, she said, her voice dreamy and distant. Sarah sent me to get you. It's time for the final ceremony. You don't want to miss the Great Awakening, do you? I knew then that I couldn't just leave whatever Sarah had given the others. It had clearly affected their minds. I couldn't abandon them to whatever fate awaited. Of course, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'll be right there. I followed Lisa back to the main hall. The scene that greeted me was surreal. The other participants were swaying gently, eyes unfocused, soft smiles on their faces. Sarah stood in the center, that crystal bow in her hands. Ah, Jade, she said, as I entered, I'm so glad you decided to join us. Are you ready to transcend the limitations of your earthly existence? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Sarah approached, offering me a cup of the tea. I took it, pretending to sip as I watched the others drinking deeply. That's when things started to go wrong. One by one, people began to collapse. Some were laughing hysterically, others crying. A few seemed to be having seizures. Yes, Sarah said, her voice taking on a fanatical edge. Let go of your earthly bodies, embrace the transformation. I realized with horror what was happening. This wasn't just some hallucinogenic tea, it was poison. Sarah was killing us all in some twisted belief about spiritual ascension. As people fell around me, I knew I had to act. I lunged for Sarah, knocking the bowl from her hands. The remaining tea spilled across the floor, filling the air with its sickly sweet scent. What have you done? Sarah shrieked, her serene mask finally cracking. We grappled, rolling across the floor in the struggle. I managed to reach my phone, which I had hidden in my pocket. With fumbling fingers, I dialed 911, gasping out our location to the operator before Sarah knocked the phone away. What followed was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I fought to keep Sarah subdued, all while watching my fellow retreat-goers slip deeper into unconsciousness. I screamed at them to fight it, to stay awake, my voice hoarse with desperation. When the police and paramedics finally burst in, it was like a scene from a nightmare. People were rushed to hospital. Sarah was arrested, raving about ascension and cosmic justice. In the days that followed, as I gave statements to the police and tried to process what had happened, the full scope of Sarah's plan came to light. She had been targeting vulnerable people, using the retreat to gather personal information and slowly indoctrinate them. The final ceremony was meant to be a mass suicide, which she believed would elevate her and her followers to a higher plane of existence. Thanks to the quick response of the emergency services, no one died, but the psychological scars ran deep. Many of the other participants struggled to come to terms with how close they had come to death, and how thoroughly they had been deceived. As for me, I was left grappling with a complex mix of emotions: relief at having escaped, guilt for not having acted sooner, and a deep sense of betrayal. The experience shook my faith, not just in spiritual leaders, but in my own judgment. It took time, but eventually I found my way back to a sense of balance. I learned to trust my instincts, to question things that seemed too good to be true, and to be wary of anyone who claims to have all the answers. I still believe in the power of self-reflection and personal growth, but now I know that true enlightenment doesn't come from following someone else's path. It comes from within, from facing our fears and doubts, and from having the courage to stand up for what we know is right. The enlightened path turned out to be anything but, yet in navigating its darkness, I found a strength and clarity I never knew I possessed. It wasn't the spiritual awakening I had signed up for, but in the end it taught me more about myself than any retreat ever could. The rusty truck swerved violently, kicking up a cloud of dust as it fishtailed on the desert road. In the passenger seat, Jake's face was a mask of terror. They're gaining on us, he shouted over the roar of the engine. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white, and pressed the accelerator to the floor. The speedometer needle crept past 90, then 100. In the rear-view mirror, I could see the menacing shapes of our pursuers, their high beams cutting through the gathering dusk. What had started as a simple act of kindness picking up a hitchhiker had turned into a high-speed chase through the Nevada desert, with both our lives hanging in the balance. My name's Alex. And 24 hours ago, I was just a guy on a road trip living out my dream of driving cross-country. I'd spent the last 3 weeks meandering from my home in Boston towards the California coast. Taking in the sights and enjoying the freedom of the open road, I was somewhere in the vast expanse of Nevada when I spotted him, a lone figure on the side of the road, thumb outstretched. Now, I'm not usually one to pick up hitchhikers. My mom's voice echoed in my head, warning me about the dangers, but something about this guy made me pause. He looked young, maybe early 20s like me, and the desperation on his face was palpable. I pulled over, rolling down my window. Where you headed? I asked. Anywhere but here, man, he replied, his voice hoarse. Please, I just need to get as far away as possible against my better judgment. I unlocked the passenger door hop and he scrambled into the car, tossing a small backpack at his feet. Up close I could see he was about my age, with wild, unkempt hair and a few days' worth of stubble on his chin. His clothes were dirty and torn, like he'd been running through the desert for days. Thanks, he muttered, sinking into the seat. I'm Jake. Alex, I replied, pulling back onto the empty highway. You okay? You look like you've been through hell. Jake let out a bitter laugh. You have no idea, man, no idea. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional static from the radio as it struggled to find a signal out here. In the middle of nowhere, I could feel the tension radiating off Jake in waves every few minutes. He tweezed in his seat to look out the rear window, as if expecting to see someone following us. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. You running from something, Jake? He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, not something, someone, a whole lot of someone's. Actually, a chill ran down my spine. What do you mean? Jake took a deep breath. I got mixed up with some bad people, a gang. They promised me easy money, you know, but it wasn't easy, and it wasn't just money. They were after my grip tightened on the steering wheel. What did they make you do? Things I'm not proud of, Jake said, his voice cracking. But when I saw what they were really into, human trafficking, man, kids, I couldn't do it. I stole some evidence, thinking I could turn them in, but they found out. Now they're after me, and if they catch me. He trailed off, but I could fill in the blanks. I swallowed hard, suddenly very aware of how alone we were out here in the desert. How far behind you are they? Jake shook his head. I don't know, but they won't stop until they find me. I'm sorry, man, I shouldn't have gotten you involved in this. If you want to drop me off at the next town. No, I interrupted, surprising myself. No, I'm not going to abandon you out here. We'll figure something out. Relief flooded Jake's face. Thank you. You have no idea what this means to me. As night fell, the desert transformed. The vast emptiness that had seemed almost peaceful in the daylight now felt oppressive, hiding untold dangers in its shadows. We drove on the headlight, cutting a narrow path through the darkness. It was around midnight when I first noticed the lights in my rearview mirror, distant at first, but steadily growing closer. Jake, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Don't look now, but I think we've got company. He twisted in his seat, peering out the back window. He hissed, it's them. How did they find us so fast? My mind raced. We were still miles from the nearest town. There was nowhere to hide out here, nowhere to run. Hold on, I growled, pressing down on the accelerator. The old truck groaned in protest, but picked up speed. The lights behind us grew brighter. I could make out the outline of a large SUV now gaining on us. Fast, faster, Jake urged, panic evident in his voice. Please, you have to go faster. I was already pushing the truck to its limits, the engine wed, and I could smell something burning. We weren't going to be able to outrun them. Suddenly, I spotted a narrow dirt road branching off from the highway. Without thinking, I yanked the wheel hard to the right. We fishtailed as we hit the unpaved surface, kicking up a cloud of dust behind us. The SUV overshot the turn, buying us a few precious seconds. I killed the headlights, plunging us into near total darkness as I navigated the twisting path by moonlight alone. Where does this road go? Jake asked, clinging to his seat as we bounced over the rough terrain. No idea, I admitted, but it's our only shot. We drove for what felt like hours, every bump and jolt sending a spike of fear through me. Had we lost them, or were they still out there searching just as I was Starting to think we might have escaped, I saw at a flash of light in the distance they had found the road. I muttered, Jake, we need to ditch the truck, it's too easy to spot out here, he nodded. Grimly I pulled off to the side of the road, cutting the engines. We grabbed what supplies we could, some water bottles, a flashlight, and Jake's backpack, and set off into the desert on foot. The night was eerily quiet, our labored breathing, and the crunch of our footsteps on the sandy ground seeming impossibly loud. Every few minutes we'd pause to listen for any sign of pursuit. We had been walking for about an hour when we heard at the distant rumble of engines. This way, Jake hissed, grabbing my arm and pulling me towards a cluster of large boulders. We scrambled behind them, pressing ourselves against the cool stone. The sound grew louder. Headlights swept across the desert, illuminating our hiding spot for a heart-stopping moment. Before moving on, we held our breath as a convoy of vehicles passed by on the road we had abandoned. Once the sounds had faded into the distance, we allowed ourselves to breathe. Again, that was close, I whispered. Jake nodded, his face pale in the moonlight. Too close, we need to keep moving. There's an old mining town about 10 miles from here. If we can make it there, we might be able to find help. And so we walked. The desert night was cold, and I found myself shivering despite the exertion. Jake kept up a steady stream of chatter, telling me more about the gang, how he had gotten involved, and all the things he wished he had done differently. I think he was talking more to keep himself calm than for my benefit, but I listened anyway, offering the occasional word of encouragement as the eastern sky began to lighten. With the first hints of dawn, we crested a hill and saw it a collection of dilapidated buildings. In the distance, the abandoned mining town. We made it. Jake breathed a note of hope in his voice for the first time since I'd picked him up, but our relief was short-lived as we approached the town. We heard the unmistakable sound of engines. No, Jake moaned. How did they find us? We ducked behind an old water tower, watching in horror as 3 SUVs rolled into the center of town. Men with guns jumped out, spreading out to search the buildings. What do we do now? I asked, fear clawing at my throat. Jake was quiet for a moment, his face a mask of guilt and resolve. You've done more than enough for me already. I can't ask you to risk your life any further. There's a ravine just past the edge of town. If you can make it there, you should be able to follow it to safety. I shook my head. I'm not leaving you here to face them alone. You have to, he insisted. This is my mess, I need to face it, but you can still get out of this. Please, Alex, go, and thank you for everything. Before I could protest further, Jake stood up and walked out from behind the water tower, hands raised. I'm here, he shouted. It's me you want. Leave the town alone. I watched helpless as the men surrounded Jake. There was a brief scuffle, and then they were loading him into one of the SUVs as the convoy started to pull away. I made a decision. I couldn't just leave Jake to whatever fate awaited him. Staying low, I crept towards the last SUV in line. Just as it was about to move, I managed to grab onto the back, hauling myself onto the rear bumper as we drove off into the rising sun. I knew the danger wasn't over, it was just beginning, but I also knew that whatever happened next, I wasn't going to abandon the desperate hitchhiker who had turned my simple road trip into the most harrowing adventure of my life. The desert stretched out behind us, silent and indifferent to the drama that had played out under its starry skies, and ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the faint glimmer of hope that somehow, against all odds, we might just make it out of this alive. The spark plug sputtered and died, leaving me stranded in the eerie silence of a town that time forgot as I coasted to a stop on the dusty main street. A chill ran down my spine. Despite the sweltering heat, boarded up storefronts stared back at me like hollow eyes, and not a single soul stirred in the oppressive midday sun. Little did I know my car trouble was about to become the least of my worries in this seemingly abandoned town that harbored dark secrets and even darker intentions. My name's Sarah, and until that moment, I was just another road tripper making my way across the American Southwest. I'd quit my soul-crushing corporate job in Los Angeles, packed up my beat-up Corolla, and set out to find myself, or at least a new direction in life. 3 weeks into my journey, I was somewhere in the vast expanse of rural New Mexico when my trusty car decided it had had enough. The town, if you could call it that, appeared suddenly on the horizon, a cluster of faded Buildings shimmering in the heat haze, the welcome sign barely legible under years of sun. Bleaching proclaimed welcome to Millbrook population 512, but as I rolled down the deserted Main Street it was clear that number was wildly optimistic. Every instinct told me to keep driving to push on to the next town, but with my car sputtering and steam rising from under the hood I knew I didn't have a choice. I needed help and Millbrook was my only option. I pulled up in front of what looked like it had once been a gas station. The pumps were rusted. Relics and weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete, but a faded open sign hung crookedly in the grimy window, offering a glimmer of hope. The bell above the door jangled discordantly as I entered, breaking the oppressive silence. The interior was dim shelves, stocked with dusty cans and boxes that looked like they'd been there for decades. Behind the counter stood an old man, his weathered face creased with deep lines. He regarded me with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Afternoon, I said, trying to sound friendly. My car broke down just outside of town. Is there a mechanic around who could take a look at it? The old man's eyes narrowed slightly. Broke down, you say? That's a shame. Old Joe used to be our mechanic, but he left town a while back. Never did find a replacement. Something in the way he said left town sent a shiver down my spine. Oh, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Well, is there a place I could stay tonight? I can try to figure out the car situation in the morning. The old man seemed to consider this for a moment. Millie runs a boarding house just down the street. She might have a room for you, but listen here, stranger. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper. Don't go ask him too many questions. You hear folks around here, they don't take kindly to outsiders poking their noses where they don't belong. I nodded, not quite sure how to respond to that ominous warning. As I turned to leave, the old man called out, oh, and make sure you're indoors by sundown. It's not safe to be out after dark. The walk to Millie's boarding house was short, but it felt like every eye in town was on me. Curtains twitched in windows as I passed, and the few people I saw on the street gave me a wide berth. Hurrying indoors, as if my mere presence was contaminating. Millie turned out to be a plump, matronly woman with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She showed me to a small, musty room on the second floor. Dinner's at 6 sharp, she said. Don't be late, and don't leave your room after that house rules. As the door closed behind her, I sat on the creaky bed, my mind racing. What kind of town had I stumbled into? Why was everyone so secretive and paranoid? I decided to do some exploring before dinner, hoping to find someone who could give me a straight answer about getting my car fixed. As I walked down Main Street, I noticed something strange. There were no children anywhere, no playgrounds, no sounds of laughter, nothing to indicate that anyone under the age of 30 lived in Millbrook. I approached a woman watering flowers outside a quaint little house. Excuse me, I said, I'm new in town, and before I could finish she dropped her watering can and hurried inside, slamming the door behind her. I stood there stunned, water seeping into my sneakers. A hand clamped down on my shoulder, making me jump. I turned to see a tall man in a sheriff's uniform, his face set in a grim expression. You're causing quite a stir, stranger, he said, his tone cold. Why don't you come down to the station with me? We need to have a little chat. My heart raced as I followed him to a small brick building with sheriff's office painted on the door. Inside, he motioned for me to sit in a hard wooden chair across from his desk. Now then, he said, leaning back in his chair, why don't you tell me what brings you to our little town? I explained about my car trouble, trying to keep my voice from shaking. As I spoke, I noticed a board on the wall behind him, covered in missing person flyers. Most of them were yellowed with age, but a few looked recent. The sheriff followed my gaze and quickly stood up, moving to block my view of the board. Car trouble, huh? He said, his voice dripping with skepticism. And I suppose you'll be leaving as soon as it's fixed? I nodded eagerly. Yes, sir, I'm actually on my way to visit family in Texas. I don't want to be any trouble. He studied me for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. All right. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to go back to Millie's, have your dinner, and stay in your room tomorrow morning. I'll personally drive you back to your car and give you a tow to the next town over. You get your car fixed there, and you never come back to Millbrook. Understood, I agreed, relieved to have a way out of this strange situation. As I stood to leave, The sheriff added, and remember, stay inside after dark, no matter what you hear, no matter what you see, do not leave that boarding house for your own safety. Back at Millie's dinner was a quiet, tense affair. The other boarders, all older folks, barely spoke, just shoveled food into their mouths with quick, nervous movements. I tried to make conversation, but was met with monosyllabic responses and averted gazes as I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something crucial. What was everyone so afraid of? Why were there so many missing person reports in such a small town? Around midnight I heard a low, mournful howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was followed by screams, distant but unmistakable. I rushed to the window, my curiosity overriding my fear. What I saw in the street below made my blood run cold. People, if you could call them that, were shambling down the road. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, and even from a distance I could see that their eyes glowed an eerie phosphorescent green. As I watched in horror, one of these creatures grabbed a man who had foolishly ventured outside. The victim's screams were cut short as the thing literally began to devour him. I stumbled back from the window, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real, it had to be some kind of nightmare. A soft knock at my door made me jump. Sarah, it was Millie's voice, barely above a whisper. I know you're awake, I know what you've seen. If you want answers, meet me in the basement. But be quiet, and for God's sake, don't let them see you. Heart pounding, I followed Millie down creaky stairs to a dimly lit basement. A small group of people were gathered there, including the gas station owner and a few of the dinner guests. We don't have much time, Millie said, her earlier fake cheerfulness replaced by grim determination. Those things out there, they used to be our neighbors, our friends, our children. It started about a year ago. People began to change, to turn into those monsters. We don't know why or how, but it spreads like a disease. The gas station owner chimed in. We've been trying to keep it contained to keep outsiders from finding out or getting infected, but it's getting worse. More people turn every night. I struggled to process this information. But why don't you leave, get help? A bitter laugh came from one of the dinner guests. Leave? There's no leaving, Millbrook. Those things, they hunt down anyone who tries to escape, and the government, they've quarantined us. Shoot on sight if anyone tries to cross the town line. Suddenly the sheriff's insistence on driving me to the next town made horrible sense. He wasn't helping me, he was making sure I didn't spread whatever this was to the outside world. So what do we do? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Millie looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and resolve. We fight, we try to find a cure, and we pray that one day we'll wake up and this nightmare will be over. As the sounds of inhuman howls and all too human screams filtered down from above, I realized my simple car trouble had led me into a horror beyond imagination. And as the night wore on, one thought kept repeating in my mind: in Millbrook, where everyone knows your name, some names are best left forgotten. The metallic click of a gun being cocked pierced the silence of the night. My breath caught in my throat as I peered through the curtains of my van. Heart pounding against my ribs, silhouetted in the moonlight, a group of men surrounded my vehicle, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. What had started as a peaceful night of stealth camping in the wilderness had suddenly turned into a terrifying standoff, and I was trapped. My name is Emily, and until that moment I thought I'd found the perfect escape from the chaos of city life. I'd spent months converting my old Volkswagen van into a cozy mobile home, dreaming of the freedom that came with life on the road. 3 weeks into my journey, I'd fallen in love with the solitude and beauty of the forest. That fateful night I'd found what I thought was the ideal spot, a small clearing off a barely there dirt road miles from the nearest town. The sun had just dipped below the horizon when I pulled in, casting long shadows through the towering pines. I remember thinking how perfect it was, the silence broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of leaves in the breeze. I'd gone through my usual evening routine, heating up a simple dinner on my portable stove, reading a few chapters of my book by lantern light, then settling into my cozy bed in the back of the van. The peace I felt as I drifted off to sleep was profound. If only I'd known how shortly lived it would be. A sound jolted me awake in the dead of night, the crunch of tires on gravel. My eyes flew open, heart instantly racing. There shouldn't be anyone else out here. I held my breath, straining my ears. The sound of car doors opening and closing followed by hushed voices and footsteps. Approaching my van, panic surged through me. Were they just other campers? But why would they be arriving in the middle of the night, and why so many of them? I crept to the front of the van, carefully peering out through a gap in the curtains. What I saw made my blood run cold. At least half a dozen men were surrounding my van, all dressed in dark clothing with hoods obscuring their faces, and they were armed. My mind raced. Who were these people? What did they want? I was miles from help with no cell signal to call for assistance. I debated trying to start the van and make a run for it, but I knew the narrow, twisting forest road would make escape nearly impossible, so I did the only thing I could think of. I stayed absolutely still, barely daring to breathe, and hoped against hope that they would think the van was empty and move on. For a moment it seemed to work. The men moved around the van, speaking in low voices I couldn't quite make out, but then came a sharp rap on the driver's side window. "We know you're in there," a gruff voice called out. "Come out now, nice and slow, and there won't be any trouble." I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. What should I do? If I came out I'd be at their mercy, but if I stayed inside they might force their way in. Another knock, harder this time. "Last chance," the voice warned. "Come out, or we're coming in." With trembling hands I reached for the door handle. I had no choice. Taking a deep breath I pushed the door open and stepped out into the cool night air. Hands raised, the group of men quickly surrounded me, their weapons trained on my shaking form. In the moonlight I could make out their faces now, hard-weathered features set in grim expressions. "What's your name?" the apparent leader demanded. "Emily," I stammered. "Please, I don't want any trouble. I'm just camping. If this is private property, I'll leave right away." The leader exchanged glances with the others. "Camping? Off a long way from any designated campgrounds." I swallowed hard. I like the solitude. I didn't think anyone would mind. "You picked the wrong place for solitudes, girl. Another man spat. "This here's our territory." My mind whirled. Territory? Were these some kind of backwoods militia, drug runners? Either way I was in serious danger. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I had no idea. Like I said, I'll leave right now and never come back." The leader stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. "It's not that simple. You've seen us. How do we know you won't go running to the cops?" "I won't, I swear," I pleaded. "I don't even know where I am exactly. Please just let me go." For a long, tense moment the leader said nothing. Then he turned to the others, searched the van, every inch of it. Two of the men moved to comply, roughly shoving past me to ransack my tiny home. I watched helplessly as they tore through my belongings, dumping out drawers and ripping open bags. "She's clean," one of them reported after a thorough search. "No phone, no radio, nothing but camping gear." The leader nodded slowly, then turned back to me. "All right, here's what's going to happen. You're going to get in that van of yours and drive. You're going to keep driving until sunrise. You're not going to stop. You're not going to look back, and you're sure as hell never going to come back here. If I ever see your face or this van again, I won't be so understanding." Got it? I nodded vigorously, hardly daring to believe my luck. "Yes, thank you. I promise you'll never see me again. One more thing," he added, his voice low and menacing. "If you breathe word of this to anyone, we'll find you, and next time we won't be so forgiving." Heart racing I climbed back into the van. My hands shook so badly I could barely turn the key in the ignition. As I started to pull away the men melted back into the shadows of the forest, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. I drove through the night, my mind reeling. What had I stumbled upon? Who were those men, and what were they protecting so fiercely? I didn't know, and I didn't want to know. I just knew I needed to put as much distance between myself and that clearing as possible. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, I finally allowed myself to relax. Slightly I pulled into a truck stop, my whole body shaking with exhaustion and leftover adrenaline. I locked the doors and crawled into the back of the van, finally giving in to the tears I'd been holding back all night. That experience changed me. I still love the freedom of van life, still seek out beautiful and remote places, but I'm more cautious now. I always make sure someone knows where I am, and I've installed a panic button that can send out my GPS coordinates in an emergency. Sometimes on quiet nights when I'm parked in some isolated spot I find myself straining to hear the sound of approaching vehicles. The memory of those armed men surrounding my van still haunts my dreams, but mostly I'm grateful to be alive, grateful for the second chance I was given, and while part of me still wonders what exactly I stumbled upon that night, a bigger part knows that some questions are better left unanswered. In the vast wilderness of this country there are secrets hidden in the shadows. And sometimes the wisest thing to do is to keep driving and never look back. Now when I find a beautiful secluded spot to camp, I always take a moment to really look around to make sure I'm not inadvertently trespassing on someone's hidden domain, and I never ever take my safety for granted. The freedom of the open road still calls to me, but it's tempered now with a healthy respect for the unknown. That night in the forest taught me that sometimes solitude comes at a price, and it's up to each of us to decide if we're willing to pay it for.